She had stopped counting the Sundays she walked into that church alone. 3 years. Same wooden pew. Same hollow silence spreading around her like a wound no one wanted to catch. Abigail Carter did not cry anymore. She had run out of tears somewhere between the second winter and the third. She simply sat, hands folded, spine straight, and endured what the town had decided she deserved. Then the door opened, and everything she had learned to survive was about to be undone by a single man who didn't know the rules. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to the channel. Follow Abigail's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1874 came to Mill Haven, Colorado, the way it always did, hard and without mercy. The sun pressed down on the valley like a flat iron on linen, and the dust on Main Street rose in small defeated clouds whenever a wagon rolled through. The mountains to the west caught the light and held it indifferent and enormous, the way mountains always are when human lives below them go on breaking quietly. Abigail Carter was 27 years old, and she had been quietly breaking for 3 years. She arrived at the Mill Haven Community Church at 9:30, same as always. She wore her clean dress, the blue one with the ivory collar, the one she saved for Sundays, and she carried her Bible with both hands the way her mother had taught her. She did not rush. She had learned early that rushing looked like desperation, and desperation gave people permission to pity you, and pity in Mill Haven was a poison dressed up as kindness. She pushed open the church door. The bell above had already stopped ringing. Inside, the wooden pews were filling fast, the way they always did on a summer Sunday. The whole town shuffling in from the heat, fanning themselves with their programs calling across the rows to neighbors. The smell of candle wax and pine, and the faint warmth of too many bodies packed into too small a space. It was a smell Abigail had known all her life. Once it had meant belonging. Now it meant something else. She walked to the third pew from the back on the left side. The family already seated in the row. The Holmers. Walter and June and their 3 grown children shifted without a word. Not dramatically, not cruelly, even if you weren't paying attention. They simply made themselves smaller, tightened their arrangement, left a gap of air on either side of Abigail that was not quite an insult and not quite an accident. It was the specific distance people keep from something they've decided is contagious. Abigail sat down. She opened her Bible to Psalms. She did not look up. Across the aisle, 2 women, Rebecca Marsh and Dorothea Crane, both wives of Mill Haven's more prosperous merchants, were murmuring behind their programs. Abigail didn't need to hear the words. She had memorized the shape of that particular conversation years ago. The sidelong glances, the tucked chins, the practiced sympathy that was really just satisfaction that something had gone wrong for someone else and not for them. The town of Mill Haven had a very clear opinion of Abigail Carter. She was, as they put it, a woman nobody chose. 3 years ago, Thomas Bellamy, owner of Bellamy Creek Ranch, the largest operation in the valley, a man with more cattle than sense and more money than either, had asked Abigail to be his wife. He had asked her in front of her father's general store on a Wednesday afternoon, with half the street watching, because Thomas Bellamy was the kind of man who treated public witnessing as a substitute for romance. Abigail had said no, not rudely, not cruelly. She had said no the same way she said everything plainly, directly, without performance. Thomas Bellamy did not receive no plainly. He received it as an injury, and then gradually as a strategy. By the following Sunday, the story moving through Mill Haven was not that a woman had declined a proposal. The story was that Abigail Carter, already 24, already unusual for her self-sufficiency, already suspect for the way she read too much and laughed too loud, and spoke her mind in mixed company, must have something wrong with her. Why else would a sensible woman refuse an offer like that? The rumor started small. These things always do. A whisper here, a pitying headshake there. But Mill Haven was a small town, and small towns run on story, the way engines run on coal. And by the time the summer turned to fall that year, the story had become fact in the way that repetition eventually becomes fact. Abigail Carter was barren, or unstable, or both. Or there was something else. something unspoken, and therefore worse. Whatever the cause, she was a woman who had refused her best offer and would never see another, and that was the beginning and end of what Millhaven needed to know about her. Her father had died 4 months after that. Her mother had been gone since Abigail was 12. She repaired the cabin on the eastern edge of town herself, growing a kitchen garden, selling dried herbs and preserves to the general store. The new general store owned now by a man named Collins, who tolerated her business because her rosemary and lavender were the finest in the territory, but who would not meet her eyes when he counted out her coins. She did not cry about it. She had for a time, and then she stopped. You can only mourn the same wound for so long before the mourning becomes its own kind of harm. She simply kept going. The church service began. Reverend Aldous stood at the pulpit and opened his mouth to speak, and the door at the back of the church opened. Heads turned the way. Heads always turn at latecomer disruptions. A ripple of mild disapproval moving down the pews. Abigail did not turn. She had learned not to look up at things that wouldn't look back at her. But she heard it. Boots on the wooden floor. Not rushed, not apologetic. Just steady, deliberate, a man who moved at his own pace and did not seem troubled by the idea of a room full of people watching him do it. The boots stopped. There was a pause. Brief, no more than 2 seconds. And then the boots came again, and they came down the center aisle, and they turned at the third pew from the back on the left side, and Caleb Whitaker sat down beside Abigail Carter, right beside her. Not at the far end of the pew. Not in the gap that the Homers had left with their careful, deniable shift. Right beside her, so close that she could feel the heat coming off him. And in July in Colorado, a man who had ridden down from the mountains already carries the sun in his skin, and she could smell wood smoke and leather, and something clean underneath all of that. Abigail went very still. Around her the ripple in the church changed. It wasn't disapproval now. It was something more alive than that. She felt it the way you feel weather before it arrives, a change in pressure, a collective intake of breath. The Homers to Abigail's right exchanged a look over her head. Rebecca Marsh across the aisle stopped whispering. Reverend Aldous, to his credit, kept preaching, though his eyes tracked down the pew for a moment before returning to his notes. Caleb Whitaker did not appear to notice any of it. He settled his hat on his knee, folded his hands, and looked at the pulpit with the same calm attention he might give to checking a fence line or reading weather on the peaks, thorough, unhurried, unprovable in any direction. Abigail kept her eyes on her Bible. She did not read a single word of it. Caleb Whitaker had come to Millhaven for one reason, and it had nothing to do with church. He needed to file a deed correction at the land office, a boundary dispute with a neighboring parcel that his father had left unresolved before he died, and that Caleb had been working to untangle through 3 different county offices for the better part of a year. He planned to file the paperwork, buy supplies, and ride back to Whitaker Mountain Ranch before the afternoon heat peaked. He had arrived on Saturday evening, taken a room at Millhaven's only boarding house, and lain awake for most of the night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a town voices through thin walls. Horses in the street. A dog that took its duties very seriously, while his body told him it would rather be on a mountain. How was not a man who slept well in other people's spaces? He never had been, even as a boy. His father had said Caleb was built for altitude, that he couldn't breathe right unless there was space between himself and the next human being. His father had not meant it unkindly. It was simply what was true. He went to church on Sunday morning because his mother had raised him to, and because some habits are stronger than the grief that comes after the people who built them are gone. He walked in late. He saw the congregation, the arrangement of bodies, the particular geometry of who sat beside whom, and who sat near whom, and there in the third pew from the back, a woman in a blue dress sitting in a space that was technically surrounded by other people and functionally completely alone. Caleb Whitaker was not a complicated man. He had a gift for reading land, where water ran, where soil held, where a cliff face might give way. He had the same gift, without quite understanding it, for reading people. Not their words, which often lied, but their bodies, which almost never did. What he saw in that pew was a woman who had made herself as small as possible without becoming invisible, and a congregation that was doing nothing to make her feel otherwise. He sat beside her because she was sitting alone. That was the whole of it. After the service, Millhaven emptied onto the front steps, the way it always did. Slowly in clusters, the whole town conducting its weekly social arithmetic. Who spoke to whom, who walked home with whose family, who lingered near the door, and who moved quickly to the street. Abigail moved quickly. She always did. She had made it halfway down the steps when she heard his voice the first time, not directed at her. He was behind her speaking to someone else, to three of them, she realized, as she turned half instinctively toward the sound. Walter Homer stood on the top step with his sons flanking him on either side, which was exactly how Walter Homer stood whenever he wanted to make a point without technically making a threat. He was speaking to the man from the pew, to Caleb Whitaker, with the patient, reasonable voice of a man delivering an important public service. "You're new to the valley," Walter was saying, "so I'll just say this once as a courtesy. That woman you sat with this morning, she's got a reputation." Caleb was looking at him with an expression that was not quite interest and not quite patience, more like assessment. "Is that right?" he said. It was not a question. "That's right. Town like this, people talk. You want to get yourself established here, start things off right, you're better served keeping different company." His eldest son nodded as though this were settled. The second son said, "She refused a good man, Thomas Bellamy. Man offers to give a woman his name, and she throws it back in his face. You got to ask yourself why." "Do you?" said Caleb. There was something in the way he said it, quiet, unhurried, like a door that hadn't opened yet, but hadn't been locked either, that made Walter Homer blink. "Son, I'm trying to help you," Walter said. "I appreciate that." Caleb looked at him steadily. "I generally find I get more use out of forming my own opinions." He touched the brim of his hat, a slight civil gesture that meant nothing, and ended everything, stepped around the Homer family, and walked down the church steps. Abigail had stopped moving. She stood on the bottom step and watched him come down, not quite knowing why she hadn't already continued to the road. He noticed her when he reached the last step, and he stopped too, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Howe was tall, genuinely tall. Not the exaggerated height of men who stand on pride, but the factual height of someone who had spent a life doing physical work in open country. Broad through the shoulders, a jaw that had seen weather, eyes that were a light clear brown, and looked at her the way the mountains sometimes looked at the valley, not with judgment, just with the settled permanence of a thing that knew what it was. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Abigail said. "Caleb Whitaker." He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm, dry, direct. "Abigail Carter. I know." He said it without apology or explanation, the way you acknowledge a fact. "Heard your name from the land office clerk yesterday. Said you were the one who keeps the herb records for the Collins store." That was not what she had expected him to say. "Yes, I've got a garden situation up at my ranch I could use advice on. North-facing slope. Soil's got some mineral issues. I'm not sure what's growing up there and what should be pulled." He tilted his head slightly. "I'd pay for the consult." Abigail studied him. She was not by nature a suspicious woman. But 3 years in Millhaven had taught her to look for the angle, the thing underneath the thing, the generosity that was really pity, or the conversation that was really an audition. She looked at Caleb Whitaker and searched for the angle. She didn't find one. "I'd have to see the soil," she said finally. "That's fair." He reached into his coat and produced a folded card, plain, no printing, just an address written in a plain, functional hand. Whitaker Mountain Ranch, about 4 miles up the West Ridge Trail. Any Tuesday or Thursday morning would suit. He held out the card. She took it. "All right," she said. He touched his hat again, nodded, and walked toward the street. Abigail stood there holding the card and watched him go, and she thought with the careful, wary precision of a woman who had been wrong before. Don't. And then beneath that, something quieter, something she hadn't felt in a very long time, warm and small and frightening maybe. Rebecca Marsh found her on Tuesday morning. Or more precisely, Rebecca Marsh positioned herself outside the Collins store at the exact hour she had calculated Abigail would be making her weekly delivery, which amounted to the same thing. "I heard you spoke with the Whitaker man," Rebecca said without preamble. Abigail set her basket on the porch railing and began checking her jars. I speak with a great number of people. He's not from here. He doesn't know the situation. There's no situation. Abigail. Rebecca Marsh was not an unkind woman. Abigail had considered this question honestly for 3 years, and her conclusion was that Rebecca was not unkind, only deeply conventional, which in practice sometimes amounted to the same thing. I'm saying this as someone who remembers you before all of this. You had a good life once. You had standing. I have standing now, Abigail said. You have stubbornness. That's different. Rebecca's voice softened. Thomas wasn't a perfect man, but he was a real offer. A woman in your position. My position, Abigail said very carefully, is the same as it has always been. I'm a woman who knows what she will and won't accept, and I decided 3 years ago that I would not accept being purchased. I'll stand by that. Rebecca opened her mouth. And I'll thank you, Abigail said, to stop deciding what I know and don't know about my own situation. She picked up her basket. Rebecca Marsh said quietly, He'll find out what the town thinks of you. They all do. Then he'll find out, Abigail said. And then he'll make up his own mind, same as everyone does. She walked inside the store. She rode out to Whitaker Mountain Ranch on a Thursday. It was early morning, and the heat hadn't crested yet, the air still carrying the cool edge that comes off the peaks before the sun finds its full height, and the trail west of town wound through scrub pine and tall grass, and then began to climb steadily until the valley opened below and the mountains closed in above, and the world got quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. She had been to the upper ranches before on herb gathering trips, but Whitaker Ranch sat higher than most, tucked against the base of a granite ridge where a creek came down in a silver thread and spread into a wider pool before winding south. It was a substantial operation, not flashy, nothing built for show, but solid, maintained, the kind of place that had been worked with consistent intention for more than one generation. Caleb was in the yard when she arrived, talking to 2 of his ranch hands about something involving a stretch of fence on the north pasture. He saw her, said something brief to the men, and came across the yard. Miss Carter. He touched his hat. Right on time. You said Thursday morning. I did. There was the faint beginning of something that might in a different man have become a smile. Come on, I'll show you the slope. He walked her along the east side of the main house and up a gentle rise toward the north-facing pitch he'd mentioned, and as they walked, he explained what he'd observed. The clay-heavy patches, the places where nothing seemed to take hold, a particular strip where even the native grasses were sparse and yellowing. He spoke about it the way Abigail spoke about plants, matter-of-factly, without embellishment, as someone reporting what they'd actually seen, rather than constructing a case. She listened. She crouched down at the edge of the problem strip and dug her fingers into the soil, dark at the surface, gray underneath, cold and dense. Iron poor, she said. And the drainage is wrong. Too much clay retention, the roots drown. She sat back on her heels and looked at the slope. You're getting runoff from the rock face. It's washing the organic layer away faster than anything can establish. Can it be fixed? Most things can. She stood, brushed her palms against her skirt. You'd want to break the clay layer in sections, work some compost in, or if you've got manure from the horses to spare. Then plant yarrow along the upper edge. It'll hold the bank and actually improve the soil underneath. Give it a season. Howe was listening to her with the same quality of attention he gave to everything complete, undemonstrative, actually there. No part of him was waiting for her to finish so he could say something. What would the yarrow run me? He asked. I can supply the seed. $2 for a summer's worth of the slope. Fair. He nodded. I'll add another $1 if you're willing to come back in 6 weeks and tell me whether I've done it wrong. That's generous. That's practical. I'd rather pay for the right answer than save the $1 and kill the slope a second time. Abigail looked at him. Something in the directness of it, the plainness, no performance, no social theater. Just here is the problem. Here is what you're worth for solving it. Here is what I want. Made her chest do something she hadn't expected. All right, she said. 6 weeks. He walked her back to her horse. At the edge of the yard, one of his ranch hands, a young man of about 19, with the look of someone who hadn't been out of his home county long, came over to take her horse's bridle, and Caleb said to him, "Hail, Miss Carter consulted on the north slope. When she comes again, see her in." "Yes, sir," the boy said, and looked at Abigail with open curiosity, and none of the layered avoidance she had grown used to in town. She gathered her reins. "Mr. Whitaker." "Caleb," he said. She paused. "Caleb," she said. "The town will say things about me, about anyone who does business with me. I want you to know that in case it affects your decision." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Carter, I've been running a mountain ranch for 9 years with no help except what I hire and what I build. I've survived 2 droughts a predator year that cost me 40 head, and a lawyer from Denver who tried to steal 3 acres of my property through a survey error. I don't scare easy." "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to be honest." "I know." He held her gaze. "That's why I asked you out here." She rode back down the mountain in the July heat, and didn't look back, and didn't permit herself to feel anything in particular about the way he had said that. She failed at the second part. Thomas Bellamy came to her cabin on the following Saturday. She had not seen him face to face in 2 years. They had managed in the particular geometry of small towns to arrange their paths so they did not intersect a tacit agreement that suited both of them, and that the town she suspected found slightly disappointing. A visible confrontation would have been more satisfying than an invisible one. He came on horseback alone, and she heard him coming up the lane while she was in the garden, and she straightened and waited for him to reach the fence. He was still a handsome man. She had never disputed that. Broad, clean-shaven, the kind of physical presence that made rooms feel oriented around him, which he knew and had always known and had relied on in the same automatic way a person relies on a leg or an arm, without thinking, without gratitude. "Abigail," he said. "Thomas." She didn't move toward the gate. "You've been up at Whitaker's ranch." "I have. I consulted on his north slope." "His north slope." Thomas repeated it with a particular inflection, not quite mocking, not quite not. "Word's getting around. Word in Millhaven gets around about everything. That's not news." He leaned on his saddle horn, and his horse shifted beneath him, and he looked at her the way he sometimes had 3 years ago before she'd said no. A look that was assessment and wanting, and a kind of baffled resentment at the fact that he could want something so much that still wouldn't comply. "I'm just saying. You need to be careful. Man like Whitaker, he's not valley. He's mountain. He comes to town for supplies and disappears for months. That's not a life for a woman." "Thomas." She kept her voice level. "I did a gardening consult. We're not eloping. You know what I mean. I know what you think you mean. You think you're looking out for me." She looked at him steadily. "You're looking out for yourself. There's a difference." The baffled resentment sharpened for a moment, and then Thomas Bellamy pulled it back behind his face, the way a man pulls a card back into his sleeve. He straightened in the saddle. "I want you to know," he said, "that what I offered still stands." Abigail's hands went still on the garden fence. 3 years, she said. "And you still believe I'll come around?" "People come around." "I have come around," she said. 3 years of coming around, and I find myself in exactly the same place I started standing in my own garden, clear about what I want, not interested in being Mrs. Thomas Bellamy. The silence between them was brief and solid. "You're going to end up alone," he said. Not cruelly, flatly, the way you state a mathematical outcome. "Maybe," Abigail said. "But alone is better than resentful. Good day, Thomas." She went back to her weeding. He rode away. She didn't watch him go. She counted seedlings instead, and she kept her hand steady, and she waited until the sound of his horse was gone before she sat back in the dirt and pressed her palms flat on the warm earth and let herself breathe. Alone is better than resentful. She had been saying it for 3 years. She still believed it. But for the first time in a long time, the word alone had caught in her throat on the way out, and she didn't entirely know what to do with that. 6 weeks later, she rode back up to Whitaker Mountain Ranch. The yarrow was establishing. Uneven. The south end of the strip was doing better than the north, where the rock runoff was heavier, but the root systems had begun to take hold, and she could see in the structure of the soil where she'd told him to break the clay that it had been done correctly and carefully. "You followed the instructions," she said. "You gave good instructions. The south end will hold. The north end needs another round of compost before winter, 2 more inches on the break. I'll see to it." He was standing beside her on the slope, and she was aware of him. The way you are aware of someone who has the particular habit of being present without pressing, not crowding, not hanging back. Just there in easy proximity, like weather that's comfortable. "How's the creek pool running?" she asked, because she'd noticed it coming up lower than it should be in July, even in a dry summer. "Lower than I'd like." His voice shifted slightly, and she glanced at him, and there was something in his jaw, a held quality, a thought he wasn't saying. "Is it a concern?" she asked. "Could be." He turned and walked toward the creek, and she followed, because there was something in his tone that she hadn't heard before. Not alarm. Something quieter and more serious than alarm. "I've been watching the upstream run. Something's affecting the flow. Could be a natural dam somewhere up the ridge, but I had a man ride up 2 weeks ago, and he didn't find anything obvious." "What else could it be?" Caleb looked at the creek. "Water rights in this valley are older than I am," he said. "Some of them are settled, some of them aren't." He paused. "Thomas Bellamy's filed for a water claim on the Millhaven side of the upper watershed. Done it through the Territory Land Office in Denver. I've got no proof it's affecting my run, but the timing." He stopped. Abigail looked at the water moving over its stones, lower and thinner than it should be, and she thought about Thomas Bellamy on his horse saying, "You're going to end up alone," and something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the altitude. "Who filed it?" she asked. "His land agent, man named Crane, Dorothea Crane's brother." Abigail went still. Harold Crane. She knew that name. She knew it because Harold Crane was the man who had helped process Thomas Bellamy's land transactions for 6 years, and she knew it because Harold Crane had been one of the first people to repeat the story about Abigail Carter's refusal in a way that added something to it, a small addition, almost nothing, just enough to make a rumor into a reputation. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah, I have some records." She said it slowly, feeling the weight of what she was about to offer. "My father kept land records going back to the 1850s. He was meticulous about it, water rights, deed boundaries, all of it. He believed records were what kept Valley people honest." She paused. "I never looked through them for anything specific. But if there's a water claim being built on shaky ground, your water, your land, some of what he documented might matter." Caleb turned and looked at her. "You'd look through them?" he asked. "For my claim?" "I'd look through them," she said carefully, "because your water should be your water, if it was your father's water, and because I don't believe in people using legal machinery to take what they didn't earn." She met his eyes. "That's all." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. "That's enough." And that was how it started. Not with a declaration or a promise or anything that required courage. With records. With soil. With 2 people who had each learned the hard way that the world does not generally reward honesty, but who had decided separately, and now together, to keep practicing it anyway. The creek ran lower beneath the summer sky. Abigail looked at the water and thought about her father's handwriting in the margins of his record books, neat, certain, unhurried, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the thing she'd been carrying alone might be something she was allowed to set down. Not yet, but maybe soon. Her father's record books were in 3 wooden crates beneath the floorboards of the cabin's back room, a fact Abigail had not mentioned to anyone in 3 years, because no one had asked, and because she had not understood until now that they might matter to anyone besides herself. She pulled them out on a Sunday evening after church, after the particular loneliness of sitting in that pew had settled into its familiar shape, and then gradually shifted, because this Sunday she had not sat entirely alone. Caleb had been there again. He had not made a production of it. He had simply arrived and sat beside her the way a man sits in a chair. He has decided is his, and the church had done its intake of breath again, and Abigail had held her Bible open to the same page for the entire service without reading a word of it. She spread the records across her kitchen table and lit 2 lamps and began. Her father, James Carter, had been the kind of man who believed that written things outlasted spoken things, and that the difference between a claim and a right was documentation. He had spent 30 years recording every land transaction, every water agreement, every deed transfer. He could get his hands on, not officially, not as any kind of county function, but simply as a private practice of a man who believed the valley deserved a memory. He had interviewed old-timers. He had copied documents from the Territory Land Office when they allowed it. He had noted dates, names, boundaries, disputes resolved and unresolved in a handwriting that was small and dense, and almost entirely consistent for 3 decades. Abigail read until her eyes hurt. She found what she was looking for just past midnight, in a book dated 1861 to 1866. Her father had recorded a water rights agreement between a man named Ezra Whitaker, Caleb's father, she was certain of it, and the Millhaven Valley Cooperative, a loose association of early ranchers who had organized the upstream watershed usage before the territory had formalized any of it. Ezra Whitaker had the primary claim on the upper fork of the creek, not a shared claim, not a partial claim. A primary claim recorded in her father's hand, with 2 witnesses named and dated, predating the territory's formal water rights system by 6 years. Thomas Bellamy's land agent had filed a claim on the same fork through Denver last spring. If this record was accurate, and her father's records were always accurate, the Bellamy claim was built on ground that didn't exist. The water had belonged to the Whitakers before Thomas Bellamy's father had owned a single acre of Bellamy Creek Ranch. Abigail sat back. She looked at the record for a long time. Then she closed the book, set it apart from the others, and went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about what this meant and what it would cost and whether she was willing to pay it. Because bringing this record forward meant involving herself in a dispute that was not hers. It meant standing against Thomas Bellamy in a way that was legible and public and could not be walked back. It meant in a town that had already decided what kind of woman she was, giving them a new reason to say she was difficult, vindictive, a woman with an axe to grind. It also meant that Caleb Whitaker would keep his water. She was at Whitaker Mountain Ranch by Tuesday morning. She did not send word ahead. She simply rode up the West Ridge Trail with the record book in her saddlebag and the knowledge of what she'd found sitting in her chest like a lit match, small, warm, and slightly dangerous. Caleb was at the corral when she arrived, working a young quarter horse through a line exercise with the patient. Unhurried attention, he gave everything. He saw her come into the yard and handed the lead to Hale without a word and came across to meet her. "You found something," he said. It wasn't a question. He had read it in the way she sat her horse. "I found something," she confirmed. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the record book and held it out to him. Page 43. Your father's name. 1862. He took the book. He opened it to the page. He read it once slowly, the way he read everything all the way through, without stopping, without reacting. Then he read it again. Then he said very quietly, "God Almighty." "The Bellamy claim is built on nothing," Abigail said. "If your father's agreement was recorded first, and it was this predates the territory system by 6 years. Bellamy's agent filed on water that was never available." Caleb looked at the page. His jaw was set. "Can this hold up?" "I don't know land law well enough to say for certain, but my father documented everything. His records have been cited in 2 county disputes that I know of. They're credible." Caleb closed the book. Howe was quiet for long enough that Abigail began to wonder if she'd made an error in coming, if she'd overstepped, involved herself in something he needed to handle his own way. Then he looked up. "Abigail," he said, "you could have sent this. You didn't have to bring it yourself." "I wanted to make sure you understood what you were looking at," she said. "And I wanted to know if you were planning to do something about it." "I'm planning to do something about it." "Good." She straightened in her saddle. "Because if you don't, he'll take your upper pasture water by winter, and you'll lose 1/3 of your herd by spring. I've watched it happen to other operations." He looked at her steadily. "When have you watched it happen?" "My father watched it happen. He told me about it." She paused. He used to say the most dangerous man in any valley isn't the one who takes your cattle. It's the one who takes your water and then acts like he did you a favor. Something crossed Caleb's face. Quick, not quite a smile, not quite grief. My father used to say something like that too. Then they both knew the same truth. He held the record book up slightly. I need to take this to a lawyer in Denver. There's a man, Harlan Price, I've used him before on the deed survey issue. He'll know what this is worth. That's the right move. It'll take 2-3 weeks to get there and back. He paused. While I'm gone, the ranch hands will be here, but I usually handle the accounts and the store orders myself. I don't suppose... He stopped. Abigail watched him work out how to ask for what he needed. You don't suppose I'd be willing to manage the household accounts while you're in Denver, she said. I was going to offer to pay you. You were going to offer to pay me after you asked me, she said. Ask me first. A beat. Then, would you be willing to manage the household accounts while I'm in Denver? Miss Carter, I'd pay you the same rate as a qualified bookkeeper. Abigail, she said. He blinked. You said Caleb, she said. So I'm Abigail. He was quiet for a moment. Then, would you be willing, Abigail? She took a breath. Yes, she said. I would. She started the following Monday. It was not what Millhaven expected, and Millhaven made sure she knew it expected something else. Rebecca Marsh stopped her at the Collins store on Wednesday and asked with the careful concern of a woman who had rehearsed the question whether Abigail understood what people were saying. Abigail said she supposed they were saying she had found honest employment with a reputable ranch. Rebecca said that was not precisely what they were saying. Abigail said she was sorry to hear it and bought her salt and left. Dorothea Crane, Harold Crane's sister, Thomas Bellamy's social ally. A woman Abigail had once genuinely liked, before 3 years of careful distance had worn that liking to something thinner and more cautious. Crossed to the other side of Main Street when she saw Abigail coming. Abigail watched her go and felt, rather than the old hurt, a tiredness. Not despair. Just tiredness, the way you feel toward a thing that has been the same wrong thing for a very long time. At the ranch it was different. The ranch hands, there were 4 of them. Hale, who was 19 and curious about everything. Tom Birch, who was 40 and said almost nothing but worked like 2 men. A pair of brothers named Oscar and Will Pratt, who were pleasant and somewhat chaotic and made up for their disorganization with genuine effort. They received her the way Caleb had told them to, which was to say, they received her without drama or qualification. She was the woman managing the accounts. She knew what she was doing. That was sufficient. On her 3rd day, Hale asked her over the lunch she had begun to put together from the ranch kitchen's supplies, because the alternative was cold bread and canned beans. Whether she had always known about plants. Since I was small, she said. My mother taught me. She believed every woman should know what the land could provide. My mother believed every woman should know how to embroider, Hale said. That's been less useful. She laughed. It surprised her, not the laugh itself, but the ease of it, the way it came up without effort, the way it felt in her chest like a window opening. Tom Birch, without looking up from his plate, said, Boy, that's the first funny thing you've said in 6 months. Hale looked wounded. I say funny things. You say things, Tom Birch said. Whether they're funny is another matter. Oscar Pratt said, He told a joke last April that I'm still trying to understand. Will Pratt said, I understood it. It wasn't worth understanding. The table laughed and Abigail laughed with them, and something in her chest that had been locked for a very long time turned a 1/4 inch toward open. She managed the accounts in the evenings at the kitchen table by lamp. Caleb's bookkeeping was meticulous, but spare. He recorded what came in and what went out, and nothing else. No notes, no context, no explanations. She found herself filling the margins with small annotations, the way her father had. Saddle repair note, left stirrup strap, replaced twice in 1 season, check the fitting. Grain purchase. Collins price higher than Dunbar supply by 12 cents per bushel. She did not know if he would want the annotations. She decided she would make them and let him object if he did. She was at the account books on a Thursday evening 9 days into Caleb's absence when Hale knocked on the kitchen doorframe. "Miss Carter?" He looked uncomfortable in the particular way of a young man who has been told to say something he doesn't want to say. "There's a man at the gate." "Who?" "He says his name is Bellamy." The room got very still. Abigail set down her pen. "Tell him I'm occupied," she said. Hale disappeared. 30 seconds later, he was back. "He says he'll wait." Abigail looked at the account books. She thought about the record on page 43 of her father's log in Caleb's saddlebag in Denver. She thought about Thomas Bellamy on his horse outside her garden fence, saying, "You're going to end up alone." She stood up. "I'll go," she said. Thomas was at the front gate on his horse, which was deliberate. Staying mounted was a way of being larger than the person on the ground. And Thomas Bellamy understood these kinds of calculations, even if he wouldn't have called them that. He looked at her when she came out of the house, and his expression did a complicated thing that she had enough experience to read. Surprise quickly covered. Assessment. And underneath both of those, the particular frustration of a man confronted with a situation he had not managed to prevent. "Didn't expect to find you here," he said. "Mr. Whitaker needed the accounts managed while he's in Denver," she said. "I'm qualified." "I know you're qualified." He looked past her at the house. "Where is he?" "Denver." "Denver." He repeated it the way he'd repeated North Slope, the inflection that wasn't quite mockery, but carried it in solution. "And he left you here running his operation." "He left me managing his accounts. The hands run the operation." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "Abigail, I came to say something, and I'd like you to hear it." "I'm listening." "Whatever records you found, and I know you found something because Whitaker rode to Denver with more purpose than a man goes to Denver for supplies. It won't be enough. I've got Harold's filing. I've got the territory seal. You think a handwritten ledger from a dead man beats that?" The breath in Abigail's chest went flat and cold. "My father was not a dishonest man," she said. "I'm not calling him dishonest. I'm calling him dead, and his records are 30 years old, and the men who witnessed them are dead too." Thomas leaned on his saddle horn. "I'm telling you this because I'm trying to give you a way out of this before it goes somewhere you can't come back from. You're already standing on thin ice in this town, Abigail. If you push this forward and it doesn't hold, then it doesn't hold," she said. "And I'll live with that." "You'll live with it alone," he said. "Same as you've been doing." "Thomas." Her voice was steady and cold and very clear. "Get off this property." His jaw tightened. "Abigail, you are standing on Caleb Whitaker's land without his permission," she said. "I am asking you to leave. If you don't, I'll ask Hale to assist you, and Hale is 19 years old, and twice your size, and has been looking for something useful to do all afternoon." A pause. Thomas gathered his reins. "This isn't over." "No," she said. "I don't expect it is." He rode away. She stood at the gate until she couldn't hear his horse anymore, and then she went back inside and sat down at the account books, and she picked up her pen, and her hand shook for exactly 3 seconds before she pressed it flat on the table and made it stop. She went back to the annotations. Caleb came back from Denver on a Friday 12 days after he'd left. She heard the horse in the yard and came to the kitchen door, and he was already dismounting, and he looked the way a man looks after 12 days of hard riding and hard thinking, worn down to the essential, the unnecessary stripped off him, the core of him visible in a way it sometimes wasn't. He came into the kitchen without ceremony, and she put coffee on without asking, and he sat down at the table and put both hands flat on it and said, "Harlan Price says the record is sound." Abigail set down the coffee pot. "He says your father's documentation qualifies as primary evidence under territory precedent. The Bellamy claim has a problem. Crane filed it through a Denver office that didn't have jurisdiction over the upper watershed. The local water board should have been involved and wasn't, which means the filing is procedurally defective independent of the rights question." He paused. "Price is filing a challenge. He expects a ruling within 60 days. And if the ruling goes your way, the Bellamy claim is voided. The water stays with the ranch." He looked at her. "Price said, And I want you to hear this exactly. He said that without your father's record, I had a fair case. With it, I have a strong one. Abigail was quiet. Your father, Caleb said, kept that record in 1862. He's been dead for 3 years, and he's still protecting this valley. She had to look away for a moment. She looked at the coffee pot and the window and the account books she'd left open on the far end of the table, and she thought about her father's handwriting, small, dense, consistent, and the 30 years he'd spent writing things down because he believed the valley deserved a memory, and she thought about how he had died without knowing whether any of it would matter. It mattered. He would have been glad to know it, she said. The record book price kept it as evidence. I'll get it back when the case closes. Caleb paused. I want you to know it'll be returned to you. It's yours. It should stay with the ranch, she said. It belongs to the land it documents. He looked at her steadily. Abigail, that record belongs to your family. My family's gone, she said. The land isn't. The silence between them was different from the silences she was used to in Millhaven. In Millhaven, silences were filled with what people were choosing not to say, the avoidance, the careful social arithmetic. This silence was just quiet. Two people in a kitchen at the end of a long 2 weeks, both of them tired, both of them present. The accounts, she said finally. I left annotations. If you don't want them, I saw. He'd glanced at the books when he sat down. The stirrup note, that's the 3rd time. I've been meaning to look at the fitting. The grain pricing is worth attention too. Collins is running 12 cents over Dunbar for the same quality. I'll talk to Collins. He won't like it. He'll like losing the contract less. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup she'd put in front of him. You're good at this. At accounts, at seeing what's there. He said it simply without elaboration, the way he said everything. Not what people expect to be there, what's actually there. Abigail sat down across from him. Caleb, she said, and she was aware of the weight of what she was about to say. The way you're aware of stepping onto uncertain ground, not afraid, but paying attention. Thomas Bellamy came to the ranch while you were gone. Caleb's hands stilled on the cup. She told him all of it. Everything Thomas had said word for word, as accurately as she could reconstruct it. She did not soften any of it, and she did not editorialize. She just reported it the way her father had reported land records, plainly, completely, because the truth was more useful than the version of it that protected feelings. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, He came to my property without my permission and told you that you were standing on thin ice. Yes. And that a dead man's record wouldn't hold. Essentially. Caleb set down his coffee cup. He did it with the careful precision of a man who is managing something under the surface and is experienced at managing it. Did he touch anything? Any of the hands? No. He stayed at the gate. He was on horseback. She paused. Hale was behind me the entire time. He was very ready to be useful. Something in Caleb's jaw loosened slightly. Good kid. He is. I'm going to speak with Bellamy, Caleb said. Directly, man to man. Not about the water claim. Price handles that now. About coming onto my property and speaking to you the way he did. Caleb. She held his gaze. I handled it. I know you did. He met her eyes. I'm not doing it because you couldn't. I'm doing it because he needs to understand what the boundaries are. Abigail was quiet. He believes, Caleb said, that because you refused him, he still has some kind of standing with you, some kind of authority over your decisions. His voice was steady and even and completely unemotional, which somehow made it more serious than anger would have. He doesn't. She didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't do anything. She just held it the way you hold something unexpectedly warm on a cold day, carefully because you're not used to it. All right, she said. All right, he said. The Millhaven Harvest Social fell on the last Saturday of August. It was the valley's major summer gathering tables in the central square. Music, children underfoot. The whole town pressed together in the good-natured tolerance that communal meals tend to produce even among people who otherwise want little to do with each other. Abigail usually arrived late and left early, and stayed near the edges where the light was thinner and the conversations were easier to step away from. This year Caleb had asked the week before if she would attend with the ranch. He had said it the way he said things plainly without pressure. "The hands are going. I was thinking the ranch should go together. It'd be good for morale. I'd like it if you came." She had said yes before she'd thought about it carefully enough to hesitate. And then she'd thought about it carefully for the subsequent 6 days and arrived at the same answer. She wore the blue dress, the same one she wore to church. The only good dress she owned, the ivory collar that her mother had once told her made her look like herself. She went to the square and found Caleb and the hands at a table near the west end, and Hale waved her over with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been watching for her, and she sat down, and Oscar Pratt passed her the bread basket, and for a moment, brief, fragile, real, she felt like a person who had a table to sit at. The town noticed. The town was always noticing. Rebecca Marsh looked over from 3 tables away with an expression that had given up trying to conceal what it was, which was envy dressed up as concern. Dorothea Crane said something to the woman beside her behind a raised hand. 2 men from the south end of the valley, who worked Bellamy's pastures, watched Caleb with the assessment of men who had been told what to think and were confirming it. Thomas Bellamy himself was across the square. He watched Abigail sit down at Caleb's table, and his face did the complicated thing it had done at the ranch gate. Except this time, there was more of it. The surprise, and then something harder, a decision being made behind his eyes. Abigail saw it. She looked away. Will Pratt was telling a story about a horse that had escaped its corral 3 times in 1 week and developed what Will described as a personal grievance against the west fence in particular. The table was laughing. Caleb was listening with a slight smile that she had begun to recognize as his version of laughing. A contained version, the kind that comes from a man who has learned to hold his feelings close but hasn't entirely succeeded. She was laughing at Will's story when she realized Caleb was watching her. Not with the assessment she was used to from people, the calculating appraisal, the looking for the problem. Just watching. The way you watch something that's doing exactly what it should be doing, and you find that worth a moment of attention. She caught his eye. He didn't look away. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "It's good to hear you laugh." She didn't know what to say to that. So she looked back at Will, who had reached the part of the story involving a bucket and a very undignified outcome, and the table erupted again, and she let the sound of it fill up the places in her that had been quiet for too long. It was later in the evening. The music had started, the fiddle and the guitar carrying across the square in the way. Summer music does the sound bigger than the instruments, because the night makes everything echo differently. When Thomas Bellamy came to their table, he came the way he always came into situations. He'd already decided the outcome of straight, in no hesitation, no acknowledgement that anything might resist him. He stopped at the end of the table and looked at Caleb. "Whitaker," he said, "I've been hoping to speak with you." The table went quiet in sections like candles being pinched out one by one. Hale stopped mid-sentence. Tom Birch set down his cup. Caleb looked up at Thomas with the clear, settled attention that was his resting expression and said, "Bellamy, I was going to find you myself before the evening was out." Thomas blinked. He'd expected something else, some version of social deflection, and the directness had landed wrong for him. He recovered. "I want to discuss the water claim, man to man, privately." "I've got nothing private to say about it," Caleb said. "My lawyer's handling it. When the territory rules, you'll hear it same time I do." "And Abigail's involvement. Miss Carter provided documentation relevant to my ranch's legal standing," Caleb said. "That's the whole of her involvement, and it was appropriate and useful, and I'm grateful for it." He held Thomas's gaze. "I'd be careful about what comes next in that sentence, Bellamy." Thomas Bellamy was not accustomed to warnings. He was accustomed to having and to taking, and to the particular social smoothness that money buys. In places like Millhaven, where who you are is determined more by what you own than what you do. I was not accustomed to a man who looked at him the way Caleb was looking at him now, without malice, without heat, completely steady. The way a mountain is steady. The way something is steady that has no need to prove itself. You don't know this woman, Thomas said. Not really. You think you're doing her a kindness, but she's been making decisions for 3 years that— That what? Caleb said. Thomas stopped. That what exactly? Caleb said. That she couldn't afford to make, that were wrong. He tilted his head slightly. You came to my property while I was in Denver. You spoke to Miss Carter about her standing in this town, and whether my water claim would hold. You were on my land without my permission, and you spoke to her in a way that I want to be very clear to you is not going to happen again. The square had gone more quiet than the music could explain. People at nearby tables had oriented slightly the way people orient towards something they sense is significant, without knowing yet how. Thomas said, This has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me, Caleb said. She works for this ranch. She documented a legal claim that's going to stand up in territory court. And she's a woman who's been treated like an afterthought by this town for 3 years, because she had the sense to say no to a man who thought his money was a sufficient substitute for her respect. He paused. That's not a mystery. That's a record. The silence was absolute. Thomas Bellamy's face had gone through several colors in rapid succession. He looked at Abigail, not at Caleb, at Abigail, and she held his gaze without looking away, the way she'd held it for 3 years through every version of this conversation. And she thought, I have not asked anyone to fight for me. I have only asked to be left in peace. And then she looked at Caleb, who was not fighting for her, not in the way Thomas would have used that phrase with its ownership and its debt, but simply stating what was true, the way her father had written things down, because he believed the truth should be documented. Thomas left without another word. The table let out its collective breath. Hale said very quietly, That was— Bread, said Tom Birch, and passed the basket, and the table eased back into itself. Abigail looked at her hands. Then she looked at Caleb. You didn't need to do that, she said quietly enough that only he could hear. I know, he said. People are going to talk. They already talk, he said. Let them talk about something true for a change. She looked at him for a long moment in the summer dark, with the fiddle starting again somewhere behind them, and the smell of pine and lantern oil, and the particular sweetness of a late August evening in Colorado. And she thought, here is a man who doesn't need to hold you down to stand beside you. She had not known until this moment how much she had stopped believing that man existed. Caleb, she said. Yeah. Thank you. He nodded once, simple, direct, the way he did everything. Then he picked up his coffee and looked back at the table where Will Pratt had begun a second story. This one apparently involving a disagreement between a mule and a gate latch that had escalated beyond what anyone had anticipated. Abigail let out a breath she had been holding for 3 years. The music played. The square filled with light and voices. And for the first time in a very long time, she sat at the center of something, instead of the edge, and she stayed there, and it was enough. And then it was more than enough, and she held that feeling carefully, the way you hold something you're not sure you're allowed to keep. The creek was still running lower than it should, but somewhere in Denver, a lawyer named Harlan Price was building a case on her father's handwriting, and the man across the table from her had stood in front of the whole town and told them what she was actually worth. Summer wasn't over, but something had shifted, and in the mountains above, Mill Haven, quiet and enormous and indifferent. The peaks caught the last of the evening light and held it the way they always did, and for once Abigail Carter looked up at them and did not feel like the valley was the wrong place to be. The territory ruling came on a Wednesday. Harlan Price wrote it up from Denver himself, rather than sending it by post, which told Caleb everything he needed to know about what was in the envelope before he opened it. A lawyer who sends bad news sends it on paper. A lawyer who rides 3 days to deliver something does it because he wants to see the face of the man he's handing a victory to. Caleb read the ruling at the kitchen table with Abigail across from him, and Price standing near the door, with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who has done something he's proud of. The Territory Water Board had reviewed the filing, examined the evidentiary record, and found the Bellamy claim procedurally defective on 2 grounds. The jurisdictional error Price had identified in Denver, and a second error that Price had discovered during the review process, Harold Crane had backdated a portion of the filing to make it appear the claim predated the Whitaker agreement. He had not done it well. He had done it the way people do fraudulent things, when they believe no one will look closely quickly, with just enough care to fool a casual inspection, and not nearly enough care to fool a lawyer who was looking for it. The Bellamy water claim was voided. The upper fork of the creek belonged to Whitaker Mountain Ranch as it had belonged to Ezra Whitaker before Caleb was born, as James Carter had recorded in 1862 in a ledger that now sat in a territory court file in Denver. Caleb set the paper down. He looked at Abigail. "Your father," he said, "just beat Thomas Bellamy in a court of law." She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. She did not cry because she was Abigail Carter, and she had run out of tears 3 years ago and rebuilt herself on the other side of them. But she pressed her lips together and looked at the ruling and said very quietly, "He always said documentation was the only thing that outlasted a liar." Price cleared his throat. "There's a secondary matter, the backdating. That's not a civil issue anymore, that's fraud. I've referred it to the territory prosecutor. Crane's looking at charges. Bellamy's looking at an investigation into whether he directed it." The room went quiet. "Thomas directed it," Abigail said. Both men looked at her. "I'm not saying that to be vindictive," she said. "I'm saying it because Harold Crane has never made an independent decision in his life. He does what Thomas pays him to do. The prosecutor should know that if he doesn't already." Price wrote something in his notebook. "I'll pass that along." Caleb stood up and extended his hand to Price, and Price shook it, and then Caleb walked him out to his horse, and when he came back inside, Abigail was still sitting at the table with her hands folded on top of the territory ruling, looking at it the way you look at something you prayed for and weren't entirely sure would come. "It's done," Caleb said. "The water part is done," she said. "The rest of it isn't." She was right. They both knew it. A court ruling voids a claim. It doesn't void a reputation. And in Mill Haven, where Thomas Bellamy had spent 3 years building the story of Abigail Carter. 1. Careful whisper at a time. A piece of legal paper from Denver was not going to change what people had decided to believe. What it was going to do, what they both understood without saying, it was make Thomas Bellamy angry in a way he hadn't been before. Before he had been confident. He had believed the Bellamy claim would hold, and the Whitaker water would be redirected, and Abigail would eventually understand that her best option was the one he'd already offered her. He had been operating from the position of a man who believes time is on his side. That was over now, and a man who has lost something he believed was already his is a different and more dangerous thing than a man who is simply trying to take it. It started small. These things always do. By Thursday, the word in Mill Haven was that Abigail Carter had manipulated Caleb Whitaker's legal case using her father's forged records. By Friday, the word was that the records had always been suspect that James Carter had been known to adjust documentation when it suited him, a claim so opposite to his actual character that Abigail, when she heard it from Collins at the general store, had to stand very still for a moment and breathe through the shock of it. By Saturday, she heard from Hale, who'd been in town for supplies and had kept his ears open, the way young men do when they're loyal, that Thomas Bellamy had been speaking at the South End Saloon for 2 evenings in a row about how Caleb Whitaker had been taken in by a woman with a history of making trouble. She did not tell Caleb immediately. She needed to sit with it first. She rode back to her cabin on Saturday afternoon, and she sat in her kitchen, and she thought about what Thomas was doing and whether it would work, and the honest answer, the answer that sat in her chest like a stone she hadn't asked for, was that it might. Not with everyone, but with enough people. Because Mill Haven had already decided what kind of woman she was, and confirmation was so much easier to accept than revision. She told Caleb on Sunday after church. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was his way, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He can say what he wants about me. I'm less concerned about that." "He's saying it about my father," she said. "My father who has been dead for 3 years and cannot defend himself." The quality of Caleb's silence changed. "James Carter's records are in a territory court file," he said, "authenticated by a lawyer and reviewed by a water board. If Bellamy wants to call them forged, he's calling the territory of Colorado forged." He doesn't care about the territory ruling, Abigail said. He cares about what people in this town believe. Those are two different things. Caleb looked at her. What do you want to do? It was the right question. It was, she realized, always the question he asked. Not what should we do? Not, here's what I'll handle, but what do you want to do? As though her answer mattered more than the obvious next move, as though she were the one who got to decide the shape of her own situation. I want to go to the town meeting on Tuesday, she said. The monthly one. I want to stand up and say what my father's records actually were and what the territory found, publicly, on the record. They'll push back, he said. I know. Some of them won't believe you regardless. I know that. He nodded slowly. I'll be there. Caleb. She looked at him steadily. You don't have to put yourself in the middle of this. I know I don't have to, he said. I'm choosing to. There's a difference. The Tuesday meeting drew more people than it had in 2 years. That itself told the story. Word had moved through Millhaven the way it always moved, quick and warm as fever, and by the time Abigail and Caleb walked through the meeting hall door on Tuesday evening, every chair was taken and men were standing 3 deep against the back wall. She felt the room turn toward them when they entered, a physical thing, the collective weight of attention shifting, and she kept walking and found 2 chairs near the front and sat down and looked straight ahead. Mayor Aldous, the same. Reverend Aldous, who preached on Sundays, who wore the additional hat of Millhaven's elected mayor, with the slightly distracted air of a man who has been given 2 jobs and would have preferred one, called the meeting to order with the firm handbell that always seemed too small for the room. He worked through the regular items with the efficiency of someone who wanted to get to the real business and didn't want to appear to want to get there. Thomas Bellamy was in the 3rd row. He did not look at Abigail. He sat with Harold Crane on one side and 2 of his pasture managers on the other, and he had the still-arranged quality of a man who has prepared for this. When the regular business was done, Mayor Aldous cleared his throat. There's been a considerable discussion this week about the territory water ruling and some associated questions about documentation. I've been asked to open the floor. He looked at the room over his spectacles. I'd ask that people keep the conversation civil. Abigail stood up before anyone else could. The room went quiet. My name is Abigail Carter, she said, because she had decided she would say it first, her own name, rather than let it be used by someone else. My father was James Carter. He kept land and water records for this valley from 1848 to 1871, and his documentation was submitted as evidence in the territory water case involving Whitaker Mountain Ranch. The territory court authenticated those records. The water board reviewed them. The ruling voided the Bellamy claim on 2 grounds, one of which was a procedural filing error, and one of which was a fraudulent backdating of documents by Harold Crane. The room erupted. Not violently. In the way rooms erupt when someone has said the true thing directly badly, in pieces. Multiple conversations at once. The particular noise of people rearranging their understanding of a situation they thought they already understood. Harold Crane was on his feet. That's an allegation. It's a territory court finding, Abigail said. If you'd like the document number, I have it written down. Crane's mouth opened and closed. Thomas Bellamy stood up. The room settled when he stood because Thomas Bellamy had money and presence and 20 years of Millhaven. Knowing his face and people who know your face give you a silence they don't always give to someone they've spent 3 years keeping at arm's length. The question I'd like answered, he said with the reasonable patience of a man who has decided he is the adult in the room, is why a woman with no legal standing in this matter was the one who went through old records and surfaced evidence for a case she had no formal involvement in. He looked at Abigail. You weren't hired as a paralegal, Abigail. You were hired to manage household accounts. How'd you come to be digging through your father's private records for Whitaker's benefit? It was a good question. Abigail had known it was coming. She had known it because Thomas Bellamy was not a stupid man, and the real attack was never going to be on what she'd found. The territory ruling handled that, but on why she'd found it, on the nature of her involvement, on the relationship between her and Caleb, that he could use to suggest something murky. Because Caleb Whitaker told me his water was running lower than it should, she said. and I recognized what that might mean, and I offered to look through my father's records to see if there was relevant documentation. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because I had the resources to do it. That's all." "You offered," Thomas said. "Just volunteered. Out of the goodness of your heart." "Yes. For a man you'd known 6 weeks. 6 weeks is enough time to know whether a man is honest," she said. "It took me considerably less than that to know it about your agent." The room made a sound that was not quite laughter and not quite agreement, but was somewhere between the two. Thomas shifted. "I'm not the one on trial here." "No," Abigail said. "Harold Crane is, and from what Harlan Price tells me, that process has already begun." Thomas looked past her, and she knew without turning that he was looking at Caleb, and she knew what he was going to say before he said it. "Whitaker," Thomas said. "You're a reasonable man. Mountain man. I get it, you don't know our ways down here. You don't know the history. But you're running a business in this valley now, and businesses in this valley need the valley's goodwill. You've put yourself in a complicated position, and I think if you're honest with yourself, you know it." Caleb stood up. He did it slowly, without drama, the way he did everything. He was taller than Thomas by 3 inches, and broader, and he had the particular presence of someone who doesn't need to fill a room because the room rearranges itself around him. "I know what complicated is," Caleb said. "Running water to 40 head in a drought year, losing your brother in a mine accident when you're 19, and your father needs you to keep the ranch going the same week. Spending 2 years untangling a deed survey error that a Denver lawyer tried to use to cut 3 acres off your property." He paused. "That's complicated. A woman who did an honest thing for my ranch, that's not complicated. That's clear." The room was very quiet. Thomas said, "I'm just saying people will talk." "They're already talking," Caleb said. "They've been talking about Abigail Carter for 3 years about things that weren't true. I expect they can talk about something true for a while without it being fatal." Thomas Bellamy looked at him for a long moment. "You're making a mistake." "Could be," Caleb said. "I've made them before, but I've never made one by standing next to an honest person. That's not the category of mistake I'm worried about." He sat back down. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, and various people said various things, and Mayor Aldous managed the room with his small firm handbell. And at the end of it, nothing was resolved in the way meetings rarely resolve things, but something had shifted the way ground shifts after a long rain, not visibly, but in its fundamental composition, the weight of it redistributed. Walking out. Rebecca Marsh caught Abigail's arm. Abigail stopped. Rebecca looked at her with an expression that was doing several things at once, and the thing it was doing most was struggling. "Your father," she said. "He really kept those records." "For 30 years, Abigail said. "He believed the valley deserved a memory." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know Harold Crane had that he'd falsified. Most people didn't." "Thomas?" She stopped. "You've known Thomas Bellamy for 20 years, Rebecca," Abigail said, not unkindly. "You know what he's like when someone has something he wants." Rebecca pressed her lips together. Then she let go of Abigail's arm and walked to her husband without another word, and Abigail watched her go and thought, "That's not forgiveness, and it's not an apology, but it's something, and I've learned not to dismiss something just because it isn't everything." The drought hit the following week. Not a gradual shortage. Caleb had been watching the creek level for 2 months and managing against the predictable end-of-summer reduction. This was different. A hot front moved down from the north with no moisture in it, temperatures climbing past anything August should produce, and the creek that had been running low ran lower, and the wells that had been reliable ran unreliable. And 3 ranches on the valley floor reported their stock ponds dropping by a foot in 4 days. Caleb rode his upper pastures every morning and came back with numbers that got worse each day, and he sat with them at the kitchen table in the evening with the careful, contained focus of a man who is managing fear. The same way he manages everything by breaking it into pieces small enough to act on. Abigail was at the ranch every day now. Not formally, no renewed employment arrangement had been made, but the crisis made formal arrangements beside the point. She came because she knew plants, and plants knew water, and the native grasses on the north slope that she'd planted with yarrow were showing her things about the moisture movement in the soil that Caleb's well counts didn't fully capture. On the fourth day of the heat front, she found it. She was walking the upper edge of the north slope, checking the yarrow's root penetration, when she noticed the way the soil was behaving 200 yards further up the ridge, damp in a pattern that shouldn't exist, given the current moisture levels, a dark seep showing through the rock clay in a diagonal line. She knelt down and dug with her hands. The soil was wet 6 inches below the surface. She sat back and thought. She thought about her father's records, about the sections she hadn't used for the water case, the sections that were older. The records from the 1850s, before Ezra Whittaker had filed his agreement. She thought about what her father had written in a margin in the 1857 volume, in the small, neat hand she had memorized without meaning to: Upper Granite Shelf, Historical Spring Activity, Rerouted by Rockfall, 1849, Origin Unclear. She stood up. She went back to the house and found the 1857 record book. She'd brought the crates to the ranch during the legal case and hadn't moved them back, and she opened it to the section on the Upper Ridge geography, and she read every entry her father had written about the water movement on the Whittaker land. And there it was. In a spring survey her father had conducted in 1858, at Ezra Whittaker's request, James Carter had documented a secondary water source on the Upper Granite Shelf, a natural spring that had been blocked by a rockfall 9 years earlier. He had noted its probable location and written in the margin in a different ink, as though added later. E. Whittaker believes clearing feasible. Did not pursue. Expense and access. Ezra Whittaker had known there was a second spring. He hadn't been able to afford to clear it, and the knowledge had sat in her father's record book for 16 years. She ran to find Caleb. He was at the corral with Tom Birch, and she came across the yard faster than she usually moved, and something in the way she was moving made Caleb hand the lead to Tom immediately and come to meet her. "What?" he said. She held out the record book. She had it open to the 1858 survey. "Read the margin note." He read it. He read it again. He looked up. "My father knew there was a second spring. He knew there might be one. He didn't clear the rockfall because he couldn't afford it." She pointed up toward the ridge. "I found a seep on the upper slope this morning. Damp soil in a pattern that doesn't match the surface water. It's in exactly the location your father noted." Caleb was very still. "If that spring is still active," she said, "and if the rockfall can be cleared, Caleb, you'd have a second water source on the upper pasture, independent of the creek, independent of anything Bellamy could ever touch." He looked at her. He looked at the record book. He looked up at the ridge. "How confident are you?" he said. "Confident enough to go up and look," she said. "Not confident enough to promise anything. But my father was careful, and the seep is real, and the location matches." "When?" "Tomorrow morning, early before the heat. I'll come with you." I was counting on it. They rode up the ridge before dawn. Caleb and Abigail and Tom Birch, who Caleb brought because Tom had spent his 20s in mining country and knew rock formation the way Abigail knew soil. The seep was where Abigail had marked it. Tom crouched beside it for a long time without speaking, pressing his fingers into the clay, moving 3 feet left, 3 feet right, reading the rock face above with the particular attention of a man who has spent years learning what formations mean. Then he stood up and said, "There's water behind that face." Caleb said, "Can we get to it?" "Not easy, not impossible." Tom turned and looked at the rockfall blocking the upper shelf, a substantial pile, but old, settled, the edges worn smooth by 16 summers. "You'd need a week of serious work, maybe 10 days. Crowbars and a mule for the heavy pieces." "What are the odds it's what the survey suggests?" Caleb asked. Tom was quiet for a moment. "Rock holds water in this formation. The granite shelf is a natural basin. If it was running before the fall, it's likely still running." He paused. "I'd say 6 in 10. Better odds than most things." Caleb looked at Abigail. "Your father wrote this in 1858, he said. "He did. And it's been sitting in your cabin under a floorboard for 16 years. "Under 3 floorboards, she said. "He was careful about where he stored things. Something crossed Caleb's face. Complex, layered, a man looking at a thing that is more than one thing at once. Practical, significant, and something softer underneath both of those. Your father might save this ranch. My father's records, she said carefully. That's not the same as my father. No, Caleb said. But it's not so different either. A man's work is part of him, long after everything else is gone. She didn't answer that. She couldn't quite. She looked at the seep instead, at the dark line of damp cutting through the clay, and thought about James Carter walking this same ridge in 1858 with Ezra Whittaker. Both of them knowing there was water and neither of them able to reach it, writing it down because that was what you did when you couldn't do the thing itself. You left the record so someone who came later could. Someone had come later. She was standing in her father's footsteps, 16 years on a ridge above a valley that had been her whole life and had spent 3 years trying to make her smaller than she was. Start the clearing tomorrow, she said. I'll help. Tom Birch raised both eyebrows. Ma'am, it's heavy work. I know what heavy work is, she said. I've been doing it alone for 3 years. Tom looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Tom. Some communication passed between them in the efficient, wordless way of men who've worked together long enough. Yes, ma'am, Tom said. On the third day of the clearing, Thomas Bellamy came up the ridge. He came with Harold Crane and 2 men from his pasture crew, and he came on horseback, which meant he had ridden past the Whittaker ranch yard and up the access trail without stopping to announce himself, and that fact alone told Caleb everything he needed to know about what was coming. Caleb set down his crowbar and walked to the edge of the worksite. Hale, who had the instincts of someone who'd grown up in a house where trouble arrived, unannounced, moved quietly to a position 12 feet to Caleb's left. Thomas pulled up his horse and looked at the clearing operation, the moved rock, the men with crowbars, Abigail 20 feet back, sorting and cataloging the exposed stone with Tom Birch, and his face did its complicated calculation. What are you doing? Thomas said. Clearing rockfall, Caleb said. On the upper ridge. On my land, yes. Thomas looked past him at the seep, which was more visible now. 3 days of clearing had opened the drainage, and the damp line had widened and darkened. There's a water source up there. Could be, Caleb said. If there's water on that shelf, it affects the downstream flow into the valley. My pastures run off the same watershed. The watershed ruling's been settled, Caleb said. Price's work, remember, the upper fork belongs to Whittaker Ranch. Downstream usage rights were clarified in the same ruling you lost. Thomas's jaw tightened. This is a secondary source. That ruling didn't address a secondary source, because it didn't know about one. James Carter documented it in 1858. If you'd like to challenge the ownership of a spring on my land that's been in my family's survey record for 16 years, you're welcome to try. Caleb tilted his head. I'd suggest talking to your lawyer first, given how the last filing went. Harold Crane said something quiet to Thomas. Thomas's expression shifted. You're doing this because of her, Thomas said. His voice had dropped, and there was something in it now that was closer to the real thing, underneath all the surface negotiations, not strategy anymore, just fury, quiet and cornered. She's been up here this whole time, hasn't she? Working your land, finding things in her father's papers, making herself indispensable. She is indispensable, Caleb said. I'd have said so to anyone who asked. She's making you look like a fool. No, Caleb said. She's making me look like a man who had the sense to work with someone smarter than he is about certain things. That's not foolishness. That's ranching. Thomas looked at Abigail. She had stopped working. She was standing with her arms at her sides and looking at Thomas Bellamy with the full, steady attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to understand. She wasn't afraid. She was past fear of Thomas Bellamy had been for a long time, possibly since the afternoon. She'd told him no, in front of her father's store, possibly since she'd sat in church alone for the first Sunday after, and discovered she was still standing. Abigail, Thomas said. And his voice for just a moment lost the strategy and became something older, a man speaking to a woman he had genuinely, in his limited and proprietary way, actually wanted. This isn't who you are. You don't belong on a hillside clearing rockfall like a hired hand. You had a place. In town. A real place. I have a real place, she said. I'm standing in it. Thomas stared at her. The place you're describing, she said carefully, was your place. It was the place where you needed me to be so you had what you wanted. That's not a home. That's a position. She paused. I have a home, Thomas. I've been building it alone for 3 years, and I am building it here now, and when that rock comes down, and the water runs, and this ranch survives a drought that would have killed it without my father's records, that will be mine. Not because anyone gave it to me, because I found it. Thomas Bellamy had nothing left to say. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the clearing site, at the darkening seep, at the future he hadn't managed to prevent. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the ridge. Harold Crane followed. The pasture managers followed. Hale said very quietly, "Good riddance." Tom Birch said, "Pick up your crowbar, boy. We've got 6 more hours of daylight." Abigail picked up her own crowbar. She was tired in every part of her body. Her hands were raw, and her back ached, and she had been sleeping badly in the heat, and she still had 3 days of clearing ahead of her before they'd know whether the spring was real or a seep that led nowhere. She set the crowbar against the next section of rock and looked at it and thought 6 in 10 odds. That's better than most things. And somewhere at the bottom of that thought, quieter than she could quite account for, she thought Caleb said I was indispensable. Not in the way Thomas had said things wrapped in ownership weighted with what he'd get in return. Just flatly the way he said everything that was true. She's indispensable. I'd have said so to anyone who asked. She pressed the crowbar into the rock face. She pushed. The rock shifted. Beneath it, in the granite seam that her father had noted in 1858, in a margin note that had waited 16 years to matter. Something moved. A sound she had to stop and listen for, small and certain and impossibly welcome. Water. Moving, coming through. The water came through on a Thursday afternoon, and by Friday morning it was running clear. Not a flood. Not a dramatic rush of water bursting through stone like something from a dime novel. Just a steady, patient emergence water, finding its old path again. After 16 years of waiting behind a rockfall, moving the way. Water always moves without urgency, without announcement, simply going where it had always been going before something stopped it. Tom Birch stood at the channel mouth with his hat in his hands and said nothing for a full minute. Then he said, "Well, I'll be." Hale said, "Is it enough?" Tom crouched and put his hand in the flow and held it there. "Run that for a week and see how she settles. But yeah boy, that's enough." Caleb was standing 15 feet back. Abigail was beside him, both of them watching the water come through, both of them quietly understanding that the thing they'd just done was more than practical. The Whitaker Ranch had water now that no drought could touch and no legal maneuver could claim. The upper pasture would hold through any summer. The herd was safe through fall and beyond. Abigail's father had written down a margin note in 1858 and put it under 3 floorboards, and 16 years later, his daughter had carried it up a mountain and turned it into a spring. Caleb said, "Your father would have liked to see this." She didn't answer immediately. She watched the water and thought about James Carter's small, neat handwriting, the way he'd written E. Whitaker believes clearing feasible, with the flat precision of a man noting a fact he couldn't act on, but refused to leave unrecorded. He would not have been dramatic about it. He would have crouched beside the channel the way Tom Birch had crouched, put his hand in the water, and said something precise and minimal and true. He would have brought a ledger, she said, and recorded the flow rate. Caleb made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I can get you a ledger." "I know where yours are," she said. He looked at her then, and she looked at him, and the thing between them that had been building since a Sunday morning in July, when he'd sat down beside her in a church pew, was right there on the surface, neither of them pretending otherwise anymore. Both of them standing in the particular stillness of 2 people who have arrived at the same place by different roads and recognize each other. "Abigail," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything yet. I know what you're about to say." He was quiet for a moment. Then what am I about to say? She looked at the water. You're about to say something honest and direct, and without any of the parts that usually make these conversations complicated. She paused. Which is exactly the problem, because I don't have a defense against honesty. He said, stay. One word. Just that. Not would you consider, or I was thinking, or any of the elaborate preamble people build around the things they actually mean. Just the word itself, plain and complete, the way he said everything that mattered. She breathed. I can't be here as an employee, she said carefully. That's not what you mean, and it's not what I could accept. No, he said. That's not what I mean. Then say what you mean. Stay, he said again. Build this with me. The ranch, the water, all of it. I want you here, Abigail. Not managing accounts. Not consulting on the garden. Here. As yours. As the person this place belongs to as much as it belongs to me. He paused. I'm not good at the fancy version of this. I don't have a fancy version. I don't want the fancy version, she said. What do you want? She turned and looked at him. This man who had sat beside her in a church, because she was sitting alone, who had ridden 3 days to Denver on her father's records, who had stood in a town meeting and told Millhaven what she was worth, who had said she's indispensable to a man trying to diminish her, like it was simply the most obvious fact in the room. I want exactly what you just offered, she said. I'm just making sure you know what you're taking on, Abigail. His voice was steady and quiet. I've been watching you work for 3 months. I know what I'm taking on. The town can adjust, he said. Or not. Either way. She looked at him for a long moment. The water ran behind them. Tom, Birch, and Hale had moved tactfully further down the ridge and were discussing something about the channel direction with great manufactured interest. All right, she said. All right, he said. And that was how it happened. No ring produced from a pocket. No bended knee. None of the ceremony that the town of Millhaven would have recognized as a proposal. 2 people on a granite ridge above a valley standing beside a spring that had waited 16 years to run, deciding that the life they'd been separately building was better built together. She told no one for a week. Not because she was ashamed or uncertain, but because she had learned over 3 years of living in Millhaven that the space between a decision and its announcement was sometimes the only peace you'd get. Once Millhaven knew it would have opinions, and the opinions would arrive in waves, and she wanted to hold the thing itself for a little while before it became public property. Caleb did not push her. He was constitutionally incapable of pushing. It was simply not in him, that particular impatience, the need to possess something by making it visible. He went back to the ranch and the herd and the settling of the new spring channel, and when she came up on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and now Saturdays, and sometimes Mondays, he met her in the yard and walked her to the house, and that was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the most she had felt in years. It was Rebecca Marsh who noticed first, which Abigail should have expected, because Rebecca Marsh had spent 20 years making a study of other people's arrangements and had developed an accuracy that was almost professional. She stopped Abigail outside the church on the second Sunday after the ridge. Something's different, Rebecca said. She was looking at Abigail with the expression of a woman running a diagnostic. You're different. I don't know what you mean. You're walking differently. Rebecca tilted her head. You came in and you didn't do the thing you always do. What thing? The thing where you brace yourself, Rebecca said. When you walk in, you've always got your shoulders like this. She demonstrated a slight drawing in, like you're expecting something to hit you. Today you didn't. Abigail was quiet. Rebecca studied her. Then her eyes widened slightly. Abigail Carter. Rebecca. Oh my goodness. Rebecca pressed a hand to her collarbone. He asked you. Keep your voice down. He asked you. Rebecca was whispering now, which in terms of information security was approximately equal to a shout. What did you say? Hey, what do you think I said? Rebecca looked at her for a long moment, and then she did something Abigail had not seen her do in 3 years. She reached out and took Abigail's hand in both of hers, and held it, simply, held it the way you hold the hand of someone you've failed, and finally have the chance to acknowledge it. "I'm glad," Rebecca said. I should have been a better friend to you. When all of this started. I know I wasn't." Abigail looked at their joined hands. "No," she said, "you weren't." Rebecca flinched slightly. "But you're saying so now," Abigail said. "That matters." "I believed Thomas," Rebecca said. "Not all of it, but enough of it. It was easier than deciding he was wrong, and you were right, because that would have meant." "It would have meant deciding to stand somewhere uncomfortable," Abigail said. "I know. I've been doing that for 3 years. It doesn't get easier. You just get better at it." Rebecca squeezed her hand once and let it go. "Will you let me help?" she said. "With whatever comes next, planning or anything." Abigail considered. "Come to the ranch on Saturday," she said. "Caleb and I are having the Hands and their families for a meal. Come and bring Walter." Rebecca blinked. "Really? Really?" Abigail straightened her coat. "It won't fix 3 years, but it's a start." The Saturday meal at Whitaker Ranch was the kind of event that happens when practical people decide to mark something without making it a production. Abigail cooked, genuinely cooked the way she cooked when she wanted to feed people, rather than when she was demonstrating competence, and the Hands brought their wives or their mothers, or in Hale's case, a girl from the south end of town he'd been working up the courage to invite somewhere for 2 months. Tom Birch's wife. A small, quiet woman named Vera, who turned out to share her husband's gift for saying a great deal, with very few words, arrived with a pie and a handshake, and told Abigail the yarrow on the north slope was the finest she'd seen at altitude. The Marshes came. Walter Holmer, who had been on the church step advising Caleb to keep different company 4 months ago, did not come, but his wife sent a jar of preserved peaches and a note that said, "Congratulations," in handwriting that had been started and restarted enough times to leave impressions on the page. It was not a party in the way Thomas Bellamy threw parties. No performance, no hierarchy, no one maneuvering for position. It was just people at a table eating food that was genuinely good, talking about the drought and the spring and the fall preparations and the particular chaos of Oscar and Will Pratt attempting to move a stuck wagon wheel that morning in a way that had apparently involved a pulley system of their own invention and a spectacular and entirely predictable failure. Caleb sat at the head of the table and said less than anyone and was visibly content. Abigail sat at the other end and said more than she had said at a table in 3 years and felt with a clarity that sometimes comes when you've been in the dark for a long time and the light comes back, that this was what she'd been made for. Not the isolation, not the endurance. This a table full of people food. She'd made a man at the far end who caught her eye twice, and both times held it for a moment longer than necessary. After the meal, when the table was clearing, and Vera Birch and Rebecca Marsh had found each other in the kitchen, and the Hands were outside, Hale appeared in the doorway. "Miss Carter," he said. "Someone at the gate." She looked up. "Who?" Hale's expression did something complicated. "Mayor Aldous." Reverend Aldous Mayer. Aldous came to the yard gate with his hat in both hands and the look of a man who has prepared a speech and is already certain it won't be adequate. He was alone, which was itself significant. Everything this man did publicly was in front of witnesses. Coming alone meant this was not a public thing. Abigail went to the gate. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." She waited. "I've been the pastor of this community for 14 years, he said. "I buried your father. I baptized 3 of the Holmer children. I've stood at that pulpit every Sunday and said the things a pastor is supposed to say about human dignity and fair witness and the sin of false judgment." He paused. "And then I watched this town treat you the way it treated you for 3 years, and I said nothing from that pulpit that was specifically directed at it. Because Thomas Bellamy is the largest donor to the building fund, and because the Holmers and the Marshes are families I've known for 20 years, and because it is very easy to speak in generalities about how we should treat each other, and very hard to say specifically in front of specific people, this woman is being wronged." Abigail looked at him. "I failed you," he said. "As a pastor, I failed you. I'd like you to know I understand that. The honesty of it. The specific, uncomfortable precision of it. The way he named his reason without dressing it up as anything other than what it was landed differently than she expected. She had imagined this conversation before, in the long evenings of the past 3 years, and in every version of it, the apology had felt either too small or too late. Standing here now, she found it was neither. It was just true. A man who had done the wrong thing and knew it and said so. "I appreciate you coming," she said, "and I appreciate that you said it plainly." "Your father was a plain-speaking man," Aldous said. "You deserve the same." "He was," she said. "He believed the truth should be stated in specific terms. He said, general truths don't protect anyone." Aldous nodded slowly. He was right. He put his hat back on. "I'd like if you'd allow it to say something specific from the pulpit on Sunday. About what this community owes you, about what happened." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's rather the point." She thought about it. She thought about 3 years of Sunday mornings in that pew, the hollow space beside her, the careful social distance of people who'd decided she was something to avoid. She thought about whether a Sunday morning statement from the pulpit was the thing she'd wanted, the repair she'd been waiting for. It wasn't quite. The repair was already happening Saturday, around her table. Rebecca Marsh's hand on hers. Vera Birch saying finest yarrow I've seen at altitude, like it was simply a fact and required no ceremony. The repair was in the small specific things, the individual human decisions, not a collective statement. But this was Aldis's repair to make. His specific wrong to address in specific terms. "Say what you believe is right," she said. "I won't tell you what to say." He touched the brim of his hat and walked back to his horse. Caleb was behind her. She hadn't heard him come out, but she knew from the quality of the air that he was there. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She turned and looked at him. "He came to apologize." "I saw." "You were watching." "I was nearby," he said. In case." She held that for a moment, the particular quiet care of it, the way he had been nearby, without interposing, available, without crowding. The way he did everything. "He's going to say something from the pulpit," she said. "Good." "It won't fix everything." "No," Caleb said. "But fixing everything isn't the goal. The goal is living honestly with what's left." He paused. "That's what my father used to say." "Mine said documentation outlasts liars," she said. "Between the two of them," Caleb said, "they'd have covered most of the important ground." 2 weeks later, Harold Crane appeared before the territory prosecutor. He did not appear voluntarily. He appeared because Harlan Price, with the particular tenacity of a lawyer who had found something real to work with, had submitted the backdated documents to the prosecutor's office, along with a technical analysis of the ink composition. Price had a contact at a university in Chicago who had studied document authentication that demonstrated the date additions had been made months after the original filing. Harold Crane confessed to the backdating on a Tuesday morning. He said he'd done it on Thomas Bellamy's instruction. Thomas Bellamy, by Tuesday afternoon, had a lawyer in Denver and a problem he was not going to manage his way out of with social maneuvering and a history of being known in Millhaven. This was federal territory jurisdiction. The men reviewing it had never met Thomas Bellamy and were not impressed by his family's history in the valley. Caleb heard the news from Price by telegraph and told Abigail that evening on the porch. She was quiet for a long time. "Will they charge him?" she said. "Price thinks yes. Directing a fraud on a federal land claim is serious." "Thomas." She said his name with something that was not quite pity and not quite its absence. "He had everything he needed. The ranch, the money, the standing. And he couldn't leave my no alone." "Some men can't," Caleb said. "The no is the thing they can't get past." "Because they think no means not yet," she said. "Not ever." "Because no one ever taught them that no is a complete sentence," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Where did you learn that?" "My mother," he said simply. "She had a great deal of occasion to use it, and she never said it like it needed explaining." He paused. "I thought about her when I first saw you in that church. She would have sat in that pew the same way, like she'd decided it was hers, and wasn't interested in anyone else's opinion about it. Abigail had heard him mention his mother before in pieces, in the way he mentioned things that mattered, not leading with them, but not concealing them. Either setting them down in conversation, like objects on a table that you can look at if you want to. She knew his mother had died when he was 26. She knew it was the other grief that lived alongside his brothers, the two of them together, making the shape of a man who had learned early that the people he depended on could be gone without warning. "She sounds like someone I'd have liked," Abigail said. "She would have liked you," he said. She had no patience for women who made themselves small to fit what someone else wanted. She would have liked that you didn't. "I wasn't brave," Abigail said. "I want to be clear about that. I wasn't brave when I said no to Thomas. I was just unable to say yes. There's a difference." "Maybe," Caleb said. "But you stayed in that town for 3 years after. That part was brave, staying and not giving in just because it would have been easier." She didn't answer that. She looked at the mountains at the last light moving off the peaks and thought about 3 years of Sundays in a church pew, and 3 years of the Collins store, and 3 years of cabin repairs done alone, and garden rows planted alone, and evenings that went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. "I don't want to go back to that," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "Whatever happens with the town, with the charges, with any of it, I don't want to go back to that." "You're not going back to that," Caleb said. "You can't promise, Abigail." His voice was steady and plain, the way it always was when he was saying the most important thing. "Look at where you're sitting." She looked. The porch of Whitaker Mountain Ranch, the mountains above the spring running on the upper ridge, the lights of the bunkhouse where Hale was almost certainly telling a story that Oscar and Will Pratt were almost certainly making worse. "You're not going back," he said. "You're already somewhere else." She moved her things from the cabin at the end of September, not all at once. There was no dramatic departure, no single morning when she loaded everything onto a wagon and made a statement of it. She moved in pieces, the way you move when you've been somewhere long enough to have distributed yourself through it. A book here, and a jar of seeds there, and the record crates. Last of all, carried carefully up the ridge trail on a clear fall morning, with Caleb on the horse beside her, and the valley spread below them gold and quiet in the early light. She had sold the cabin to a young couple who'd come up from New Mexico territory in August, a husband who planned to farm, and a wife who kept looking at Abigail's kitchen garden with the expression of someone seeing something they didn't know they'd been missing. Abigail had walked her through every plant before she left its name and its use, and the particular way it needed to be harvested, because her mother had done the same for her, and because some knowledge should travel from hand to hand, rather than being left to rediscovery. The cabin's new owner had stood in the kitchen doorway watching her go and said, "It's a good house." "It is," Abigail said. "I repaired most of it myself. The east wall's solid, but the north shutter needs watching in winter. The garden faces southeast. You'll get good sun all summer." "Thank you," the woman said, "for all of it." Abigail nodded and walked to her horse and didn't look back. Not because she was sad to leave. She wasn't exactly, or she was, and wasn't simultaneously in the way of things that have been both shelter and prison, but because she'd found that forward was the better direction for looking, and she intended to keep practicing it. The record crates went into a room Caleb had cleared on the west side of the house, a room with good light and a proper shelf, and a desk that had been his father's. She arranged the books on the shelves in chronological order, the way her father had kept them, and she put the 1858 volume, the one with the margin note, the one with E. Whitaker believes clearing feasible, written in a different ink on the end of the second shelf, where it would be easy to reach because she intended to add to it. Not her father's records anymore. Hers, the Valley's, whoever needed them, whoever. Caleb came to the door of the room and looked at the shelves. "There's space for more," he said. "I'm counting on that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "We should talk about the wedding." She turned. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms folded and the slight quality of someone who has something prepared. "We should," she said. "I don't want anything elaborate." "Neither do I." "Church," he said. "Aldous, the hands, and whoever wants to come." He paused. "If Millhaven wants to show up, they can show up. If they don't, we'll have a smaller table." "Rebecca will come," Abigail said. "I expect she will." Tom and Vera. "Obviously. Hale will probably ask that girl." "He's been asking her to everything for 2 months," Caleb said. "She keeps saying yes. I've told him to stop being surprised about it." Abigail smiled. It happened more easily now than it had in years, not effortfully, not as a thing she produced for social occasions, but simply as a response to things that were genuinely good, of which there were more lately than she'd known how to expect. "Caleb," she said. "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "When you sat beside me," she said, "that first Sunday, did you know what you were starting?" He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I knew you were sitting alone, and that I didn't see a reason for it. That's all I knew." "That's all." "That was enough," he said. "Most things start with less than that." She looked at her father's record books on the shelf at 16 years of waiting, reduced to a margin note at a spring that had needed one person to look at the right piece of ground with the right knowledge at the right moment. "Most things start with less than that." "November," she said. "I want a November wedding. The valley's quiet in November. Just us and the people who've earned a seat at the table." "November," he said. "Done." Thomas Bellamy's case moved through the territory system with the slow grinding certainty of legal processes that have good evidence. By October, he had accepted a settlement arrangement that involved significant financial penalties and the permanent revocation of his water claim filings. He was not imprisoned. His lawyer was better than the situation strictly deserved, but he was diminished in the way that public exposure of a private fraud diminishes a man whose entire power has rested on what other people believe about him. He left Millhaven before the first snow. Abigail heard about it from Collins at the general store, Collins who had been counting her coins without meeting her eyes for 3 years, and who had since the town meeting and the territory ruling, and Reverend Aldis's specific Sunday morning statement, begun to meet her eyes with the slightly effortful concentration of a man practicing a new habit. "Sold the ranch?" she asked. "Sold it to a cattle operation out of Texas," Collins said. "They'll run it under new management starting spring. And Harold Crane left last week. Went to his sister's in Kansas, I heard." Collins set her change on the counter. All of it counted correctly, placed directly in her hand rather than on the counter beside her hand. "For what it's worth, Miss Carter, I mean Mrs. Ah." He stopped. Word of the engagement had reached him approximately 48 hours after it became known to Rebecca Marsh, which was to say it had reached him very quickly. "I mean, I know I haven't always—" "Collins," she said. "It's fine. It isn't quite." "No," she said. "But we're starting from where we are not where we should have been." He nodded. He looked relieved in the way of someone who had expected punishment and received instead an accounting honest, clear, and forward-facing. She picked up her basket and walked out into the October sun, and the street of Millhaven looked the same as it always had. The same storefronts and the same dust and the same mountains framing everything. And it was the same, and it was entirely different the way a place changes when you stop standing in it alone. Caleb was at the hitching post with both horses waiting. He handed her her reins when she came out, and they mounted and turned toward the West Ridge Trail, toward the ranch, and the spring, and the record books, and the life they were building in the specific, documented, undeniable way her father had taught her a life should be built. "How was Collins?" he said. "Trying," she said. "That's something." "It is," she said. "It's not nothing." They rode up the ridge in the fall light, and the valley fell away below them, and the mountains above were beginning to get their first thin line of snow on the highest peaks, and the air was clear and cold, and smelled of pine resin, and the particular cleanness of altitude, and Abigail Carter rode toward the home she had not waited to be given, but had found by staying honest and staying standing, and being exactly, precisely, entirely herself. The creek ran full beside the trail. The spring on the upper ridge was still running, would run through winter, would run in the drought years, and the wet years would run for as long as the granite held, which was longer than any of them would be here to measure. Her father had known it was there. She had found it. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough. They married on a Saturday in November, when the valley had gone quiet, the way it goes quiet in the weeks before the first real snow settled. Unhurried, the whole landscape holding itself still, as though it knows what's coming and has made its peace with it. Reverend Aldous performed the ceremony. He had asked Abigail 3 weeks before what she wanted said. She had thought about it for 2 days and then written him a single paragraph. Plain, direct her father's daughter through to the end, that said she wanted nothing about what a wife owed a husband or what a woman's role was in a home, and she wanted nothing about patience or submission or the particular brand of wifely virtue that Millhaven had spent 3 years suggesting she lacked. She wanted something true, something about two people choosing each other with full knowledge of what that choosing cost. Aldous had read her paragraph and said, "I can do that." He had done it well. The church was not full. It was not empty either. Rebecca and Walter Marsh were in the second row. Rebecca with red eyes, she would not acknowledge, and Walter with the look of a man attending something he wished he'd had the character to support 3 years earlier. Tom Birch sat with Vera, both of them upright and correct, in the way of people who take ceremonies seriously. Hale was in the fourth row with the girl from the south end. Her name was Clara, and she had the quiet attention of someone who understood that what she was watching mattered beyond the ceremony itself. Oscar and Will Pratt had argued over the seat closest to the aisle, and compromised by sitting on each other's outside, and were both slightly crooked as a result. Collins had come. He sat in the back alone, hat on his knee, and when the ceremony ended, he was one of the first to shake Caleb's hand, and the first to look Abigail in the eye while doing it. Mayor Aldous. Reverend Aldous said the things Abigail had asked him to say, and some things he'd added himself that were better than she'd anticipated, including a specific and unambiguous acknowledgement from the pulpit in front of every person in that church that this woman had been wronged by this community and had carried herself through that wrongdoing with more grace than it deserved. He said it plainly in specific terms, the way her father had believed the important things should always be said. The church was completely silent when he said it. Abigail held Caleb's hand and looked straight ahead and did not let her face do the thing it wanted to do, which was collapse entirely. She held it together through Will and the pressure of his hand around hers, steady, constant, the specific weight of a man who is present in the complete sense of the word, and when Aldous finished, she breathed once slowly from the bottom of her lungs. Caleb turned and looked at her. "All right," he said quietly enough that only she could hear. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." He held her gaze for a moment, with that particular quality of his, reading the thing that was actually there, not the thing she was presenting, and whatever he found satisfied him, because he nodded once and turned back to the Reverend, and the ceremony continued. When it was done, when Aldous said the words that made it legal and binding and permanent under the laws of Colorado territory, Caleb turned to her, and he kissed her once briefly, with the same quality as everything else he did, direct, real, no performance. Hale started clapping. Oscar Pratt joined in approximately 1 beat later, which was faster than anyone expected from Oscar Pratt, and earned him a surprised look from his brother. The rest of the church followed, and the sound of it filled the space that had been 3 years ago and 4 months ago, and every Sunday morning, in between the emptiest place Abigail Carter had ever sat. She stood in it now, and let it be full. The first years of the Whittaker marriage were not easy, in the way that good things are often not easy, not troubled, not unhappy, but demanding in the way of a life that is actually being built, rather than simply being lived. The ranch grew carefully, the way Caleb did everything one solid decision at a time. The spring on the upper ridge ran through its first winter, better than Tom Birch had predicted, the flow steady and clear, even when the lower creek dropped under the February freeze, and by spring, the upper pasture had water through the dry months, and the herd numbers climbed accordingly. Abigail kept the records. She kept them in her father's format. The small, neat entries, the dated observations, the margin notes for things that couldn't quite fit in a standard line. She recorded water levels and soil conditions, and the progress of the North Slope yarrow through its second and third seasons. She recorded feed prices and weather patterns, and the names of every hand who worked the Whittaker Ranch with their start dates and their specialties, because she believed, as her father had believed, that people should be documented as carefully as land, that their presence in a place was as much a part of its history as the geography. She also began keeping a second set of records separate from the ranch books. These were valley records. Water agreements, boundary surveys, land transfers. All the things her father had kept continued forward in his absence, because someone had to, and because she had learned on a granite ridge above Millhaven that the records her father kept in 1858 could save a ranch 16 years later, and she had no way of knowing which of the things she was writing down now would matter to someone she hadn't met yet. It was Tom Birch who noticed first on an evening when she'd stayed late at the desk in the record room, and he'd come to the door to tell her supper was ready. "You're doing what your father did," he said. "I know," she said. "The whole valley. What I can reach of it," she said. "People bring things to me when they have disputes or questions. I verify what I can record, what I can verify." Tom was quiet for a moment. "You're going to end up being the person everyone comes to." "I expect so," she said. "Is that what you want?" She set down her pen and looked at the shelf of record books, her father's, and now the beginning of hers. The first new volume standing beside the last of his, like a continuation of a sentence that had paused for 3 years. "It's what I'm for," she said. "The same way the spring is for the pasture and the yarrow is for the bank. Things go where they're useful." She paused. "My father taught me that. He said every person has a thing they're fitted to, and the work of a life is finding it and doing it without apology." Tom considered this. He was a wise man. He was a practical man, she said. It looked like wisdom because practical and wise aren't as far apart as people think. 3 years after the wedding, a woman came to the Whitaker Ranch on a Tuesday morning asking for Abigail. Her name was Catherine Marsh. "No relation to Rebecca," she said immediately, with the preemptive exhaustion of someone who'd clarified this many times, and she had come up from the south end of the valley where her husband had a small cattle operation that was being absorbed piece by piece by the new Texas outfit that had bought Bellamy Creek Ranch after Thomas left. The new owners had filed a water claim on the South Fork. Catherine's husband had records from the original Valley Compact, but he didn't know how to read them or who to take them to. She had been told by 3 separate people in Millhaven to go see Abigail Whitaker. Abigail sat with her for 2 hours at the kitchen table. She read the records. She explained what they meant. She wrote out a clear summary of the relevant rights language and told Catherine which parts were sound and which parts would need a lawyer to formalize, and gave her Harlan Price's address in Denver with a note she wrote on the spot explaining the situation so Price could assess it quickly. Catherine Marsh, not related to Rebecca, looked at the summary in her hands and said, "I didn't know where else to go." "You came to the right place," Abigail said. "Everyone said—" Catherine stopped. "They said you'd help, that you'd look at it plainly and tell us what was real." "That's what I do," Abigail said. "It's not complicated." "It is though," Catherine said quietly. "When you're the one in trouble, and the people with power are telling you something different than what the truth is, it's very complicated. It's hard to know who to trust." Abigail held her gaze. "I know," she said. "I know exactly what that is." She put her hand briefly on Catherine's, and then stood up and went to the shelf and came back with the 1858 record book, the one with the margin note, the one that had started all of it, and opened it to the first page where her father had written in his small dense hand the simple heading, "Valley Records. J. Carter. For whoever needs them." "My father started this in 1848, she said. "He kept it for 30 years. He believed that honest documentation was the only thing that protected ordinary people from extraordinary power." She closed the book and handed Catherine the summary instead. "That's what I'm continuing. You're not the first person who's come here. You won't be the last." Catherine left with the summary and the lawyer's address, and the particular look of someone who arrived carrying something alone and is leaving. Carrying it differently. Not lighter exactly, but differently distributed, the weight shared rather than singular. Caleb was in the yard when Catherine rode out. He watched her go, and then he came inside and found Abigail at the record desk, writing up the consultation in her Valley records with the date and the parties and the relevant documentation in the same format her father had used for 30 years. "The South Fork," he said. "The new Bellamy outfit is moving on it," she said. "Different name, same play. You think Price can hold it? If the records support it, yes." She looked up. "And I've looked at the records, and they do." Caleb leaned in the doorway. "You know what's going to happen," he said. "More people are going to come. South and East Valley. Anyone who's got a dispute and doesn't know where to take it." "I know. You want that." She set down her pen. "Remember when you asked me what I wanted, and I said I wanted to stand up at the town meeting and say what my father's records actually were? I remember. And you said they'd push back. They did. And I said I knew." She looked at him steadily. "This is the same question and the same answer. Yes, I want it. Yes, there will be resistance from people who don't want their claims looked at too closely. And yes, I'm doing it anyway because someone has to, and because I'm fitted for it, and because my father spent 30 years building the foundation, and I am not going to let it sit unused." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and picked up her pen. He pushed off the doorframe and went back to the yard, and she heard him telling Hale something about the north fence, and the sounds of the ranch settled around her boots on the porch, the distant horses. Vera Birch's voice from the kitchen where she'd taken to helping on the busy days, and she wrote in the Valley Record and thought about her father, who had never seen this room, never known this ranch, never met Caleb Whitaker, and who had nevertheless been in this room every day since she'd moved his books to this shelf. Present, documented, outlasting. The twist that Millhaven didn't expect came in the spring of the 4th year, and it came from a direction no one had been watching. Harlan Price wrote from Denver to say that the Territory Water Board, having processed 3 successful claims based on Abigail's documentation of the Whitaker case, was formally requesting that the Whitaker records be designated as official Valley Archive material, meaning they would be recognized legally as primary historical documentation for water and land disputes across the county. Price's letter was 2 pages long and dense with legal language, but the substance of it was simple: what James Carter had spent 30 years recording in private as a personal act of faith in the Valley's need for a memory was now going to be formally recognized as exactly what it had always been. Abigail read the letter twice. She set it down. She picked it up and read it again. Then she went to the shelf and took down the first volume. 1848, her father's first year. The handwriting slightly less certain than it would become a younger man, beginning something whose full extent he couldn't yet see, and she held it in both hands and stood there for a long moment in the room with the good light and the desk that had been Ezra Whitaker's and the spring running somewhere above her on the granite ridge. She was still standing there when Caleb came in. He saw her face. He came across the room without asking and stood beside her and looked at the letter on the desk. He read it. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Your father just became an official part of Colorado Territory's legal history." She pressed her lips together. The same thing she'd done when the water had run clear for the first time, the same thing she'd done in the church when Aldous had said the specific thing from the pulpit. Her version of what other people did with tears. "He would have been very annoyed by all the bureaucratic language," she said. "He would have been pleased about the outcome," Caleb said. "He would have said the outcome was obvious," she said. "That if you do the honest thing consistently for 30 years, eventually the world catches up to it." Was he right? She looked at the letter. She looked at the record book in her hands. She looked at the shelf at the 22 volumes of her father's work, and the 4 she'd added in the years since, all of it in chronological order, all of it waiting to be useful to someone who needed it. "Yes," she said. He was right. Caleb put his hand over hers, where she held the record book. A brief firm pressure, the specific weight of a man who does not speak the things he means in elaborate language, but puts them in the contact of a hand on a hand, and then he let go and stepped back. "I'm going to tell the hands," he said. "They'll want to know." "They'll want a meal to go with it," she said. "Obviously," he said. "Vera's already here." She smiled. He went out. She stood alone with her father's record book and let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the bureaucratic recognition, not the legal language, but the simple human fact. Underneath all of it, a man had believed the truth should be written down, and his daughter had carried that belief through the worst years of her life, and now the thing he'd built was going to protect people he'd never met, in disputes that hadn't happened yet for years. They couldn't count from here. She set the record book back on the shelf in its place beside the others. She picked up her pen. She opened her current Valley record to the next blank page and wrote the date, April 14th, 1878. And below it began the entry for the Territory Archive designation, in the same small neat hand her father had used, because some things should be inherited precisely. 5 years after the wedding, Hale got married. He married Clara from the South End, who had kept saying yes to everything he invited her to for 2.5 years before he worked up sufficient courage to make it official, and who had apparently decided to let him get there at his own pace, because she was a patient woman with good judgment, and she'd understood from the beginning that what she was waiting for was worth the wait. The wedding was at the Whitaker Ranch. It had become, without anyone formally deciding it, the place where things were marked in the valley. Not because the Whitakers were wealthy, they were comfortable, not wealthy, but because the table at Whitaker Ranch was the kind of table that had room at it. Abigail ran it the way she ran the records and the garden and the consultation for valley families with documentation problems, thoroughly, without performance, with the specific attention of someone who knows that the details are where the meaning lives. She had cooked for 3 days. The Hands families came, and the Marsh family. Rebecca was failing her health, declining in the way of a woman who has lived with something unresolved for too long and is finally gently letting it resolve. And Mayor Aldous came and performed the ceremony with the same specific care he had brought to the Whitaker ceremony 5 years before. Tom and Vera Birch sat in the same chairs they'd occupied at every gathering here for 5 years, and looked at the table with the settled satisfaction of people who have watched something become what it was always supposed to be. At the end of the evening, when the older guests had gone, and the Hands were outside, and the table was quiet, Clara found Abigail in the kitchen. She stood in the doorway with the look of someone who has something to say and has been deciding when to say it. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said. "Abigail," Abigail said. Clara smiled. "Abigail, Hale told me about when you first came here, the consultation on the garden slope, and about what the town—" She stopped. "He said you were the bravest person he'd ever seen. Not because you fought anyone, because you stayed." Abigail looked at the young woman. She corrected herself. She was 23, who had just married the boy who had waved her over to a ranch table 5 years ago with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone who hadn't learned yet to be careful about who he welcomed. "Hale gives me too much credit," Abigail said. "I stayed because leaving would have meant Thomas Bellamy won. That's not bravery, that's stubbornness." "My mother always said they were the same thing in a good person," Clara said. Abigail looked at her. "Your mother sounds like someone I should meet." "She's coming up from New Mexico in the fall," Clara said. "I'd like to bring her here if that's all right." "Bring her here," Abigail said. "There's always room." It was Rebecca Marsh who said the thing that mattered most, and she said it 18 months before she died on a Tuesday afternoon in the record room at Whitaker Ranch, when she'd come officially to ask Abigail to look at a boundary survey that Walter had questions about and had stayed unofficially for 2 hours that had nothing to do with boundary surveys. She sat across the desk from Abigail, and she looked at the record shelves. All of them. Her father's 22 volumes and Abigail's 8, and growing. And she said, "Do you remember what I said to you when all of this started with Whitaker? I said Thomas would find out what the town thought of you." "I remember," Abigail said. "I said they all do eventually." Rebecca's voice was quieter than it used to be. Her health had been in decline for a year. "I meant it as a warning. I meant he'll find out you're too much trouble is what I meant." "I know what you meant." "What he found out," Rebecca said, "was the opposite." She looked at the shelf again. "He found out what you actually were, and so did the rest of us, and we were wrong. Abigail, in the specific way I told you Aldous was wrong. The way that isn't just a mistake, but a choice. We chose to believe Thomas because it was easier." "Rebecca." Abigail kept her voice even. "You've said this before. I'm saying it again," Rebecca said, "because I'm not going to have as many chances to say things as I used to, and I want to say this one while I can." She looked at her directly. "You didn't become who you are because this valley treated you well. You became who you are in spite of the fact that it didn't. And then you turned around and served it anyway. That's the thing I want you to know I see. That I saw it." The room was very quiet. Abigail set down her pen. My father believed that a place only deserves its history if someone's willing to keep it honestly, she said. That meant the good parts and the bad parts. What the town did to me is in the record. What it did afterward is in the record too. She paused. That's not forgiveness. That's just documentation. Accurate documentation. Rebecca looked at her for a long moment. You're a remarkable woman. I'm a practical woman, Abigail said. My father raised me to be practical. Caleb loves me for it. The valley uses me for it. She picked up her pen. That's a complete life. I don't need it to be remarkable. Rebecca stayed another hour, and they talked about the boundary survey, and Walter's health, and whether Clara was expecting she was, though she hadn't announced it, but Rebecca had 20 years of watching people, and could read the signs, and when she left, she put both hands briefly on Abigail's shoulders in the doorway. The way you touch something you want to remember the shape of. And then she walked to her horse and rode back to town. The last Sunday of October was golden, and still the kind of fall morning that Colorado occasionally produces as though apologizing for the winters. The sky a blue so clear and deep, it looked like something painted rather than something real. Abigail wore the blue dress. The same one. The ivory collar her mother had loved, the dress she'd worn every Sunday for years. The dress that had sat beside an empty pew on the worst mornings and the best ones. She'd had it let out once at the shoulders, where the years of ranch work had broadened her and repaired the hem twice, and it was still the dress she wore to church because it was hers, and it fit her, and she had never in her life bought a new thing, simply because the old one had history. Caleb wore his good coat and his good hat, and looked exactly like himself, which was all he ever looked like, and which Abigail had concluded long ago, was considerably more than most people managed. They walked into the Millhaven Community Church together, the way they had walked in every Sunday for 5 years, and the church was nearly full, because it was always nearly full now on a fine fall morning, and people made room for them in the third row from the back on the left side, which was where they always sat, and no one left a gap. No one had left a gap in years. Abigail sat down. Caleb sat beside her. The Whitaker children. Ezra James, who was 4, and had his father's eyes, and his grandfather Carter's bottomless interest in how everything worked, and Nora, who was 2, and had no patience for sitting still, and was currently constructing a small rebellion out of the hymnal, arranged themselves between their parents, with the particular organized chaos of small people who have been doing this long enough to have opinions about it. Hale and Clara were 2 rows ahead with their infant son, who was asleep with the profound commitment of someone who has decided the sermon is not for him. Tom and Vera Birch were across the aisle. Rebecca Marsh's husband Walter sat in his family's usual pew alone. Now with the settled grief of a man learning what a space feels like when it's not filled by the person it was shaped around. Reverend Aldous began the service. Ezra James, after 30 seconds of genuine effort at stillness, leaned against Abigail's arm and looked up at her. "Mama," he said at a volume that was technically a whisper and practically a broadcast. "Is this the long part or the short part?" "The long part," she whispered back. He considered this with the solemn pragmatism of a 4-year-old processing bad news. Then he settled more firmly against her arm, apparently deciding that if the long part was inevitable, proximity to his mother was the reasonable response to it. She put her hand on the top of his head briefly, warm, solid, entirely himself, and felt Caleb watching them from the other side. She looked over. Howe was watching her with that expression she had learned over 5 years, the one that looked like nothing in particular to anyone who didn't know him, and was to her the most transparent thing about him. The one that meant here, this, you. She held his gaze for a moment. "What?" she said quietly. "Nothing," he said. "Same as the first time you asked me that." She remembered. The ridge the yarrow 6 weeks is enough time to know if a man is honest. She looked at him in the church where it had started 5 years, and a marriage and 2 children, and a spring and 26 Valley records, and 1 legal designation from the Colorado Territory later, and she thought about everything James Carter had written down in 30 years of ledgers, and everything she had continued, and everything Ezra James would probably continue after her, because he was 4 years old and already asking how the water moved in the creek and why the yarrow roots went sideways instead of straight down. Nora had given up on the hymnal and was now leaning against Caleb's arm with the absolute confidence of someone who has never once doubted she would be received. He had shifted to accommodate her without looking, without thought, the automatic adjustment of a man who has been doing this long enough that it is simply part of his body's understanding of what it's for. Abigail looked at the pew. Full. Completely, entirely, structurally. Full. 4 people in the space that had once held only her and the particular shape of absence that absence carves in a person when it goes on long enough. She thought about the Sunday mornings she had walked in alone and sat in the hollow space the congregation made around her and held her Bible open to Psalms and read nothing at all. She thought about the day a man with mountain boots had walked down the aisle without apology and sat beside her because she was sitting alone and he did not see a reason for it. She thought about her father's handwriting. She thought about the water coming through the rock. She thought about all the things that had waited the spring, the records, the life that was now so full she sometimes stood in the middle of it and could not quite account for how she had gotten here from there. And she thought about what her father had written in the first line of his first record book in 1848, before she was born, before any of it. For whoever needs them. She had needed them. She had been found by them. And now she was one of them, part of what the valley would remember, part of what would outlast her, the way her father's work was outlasting him, written into the record of a place that had once tried to write her out of it. Nora, sensing perhaps that her mother's attention had drifted somewhere internal, reached across Caleb and grabbed Abigail's hand with the 2-year-old's absolute conviction that she was owed it. Abigail closed her fingers around her daughter's small ones. After the service in the yard, she stood in the October sun while the children ran loose and Caleb talked fence lines with Tom Birch, and Hale rocked his son in a way that was clearly a performance of competence. He was still building toward actually having, and Walter Marsh came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at the church door the way people look at the last place they saw someone. She was glad, he said finally, at the end, that she'd said what she said to you. She told me it was the thing she was most glad about. Abigail looked at him. She was a good woman, she said. She got there in her own time. That matters. Walter nodded. He put his hat on. He walked toward his horse. Caleb appeared beside her. Ready, he said. She looked at the church. At the pew visible through the open door, the 3rd row from the back on the left side, full of coats. Now people collecting their things. No spaces. No careful distances. Just people filling in the room the way people do when they've stopped sorting themselves by who they've decided is acceptable. She had sat in that pew for 3 years alone. She had sat in it for 5 years with everything she had. Do you remember, she said, what you said to me the first time I asked you what you were doing? Why you sat beside me? Caleb thought about it. I said you were sitting alone. You said you only saw someone sitting alone, she said. That's what you said. That's what I saw. That's what I needed someone to see, she said. Just that. Just the plain fact of it. He was quiet for a moment. It wasn't complicated, he said. It was never complicated. No, she said. It wasn't. Ezra James came running from the direction of the church steps at the speed of a child who has been sitting still for an hour and has strong opinions about it, calling for his father about something involving a stick and a very important discovery. Caleb caught him without looking, swung him up to his hip in the single motion of a man who has been doing this for 4 years and has it completely figured out. And whatever Ezra James had discovered a particularly interesting rock, from the look of it, which he presented to his father, with the gravity of someone conveying significant news, received Caleb's complete, genuine, unperformed attention. Nora had found Clara, and was examining the baby with the concentrated scrutiny of someone who is still forming her opinion of infants as a category. Abigail looked at her family assembled in the October sun outside the church in Millhaven, Colorado in the year 1879, and she thought here, this, you, the same thing Caleb's face said to her every time he forgot to keep it from saying it. She thought about the woman who had sat alone in the back pew and stopped crying and started enduring and kept going because going was the only direction that led anywhere. She thought about her father's voice saying, "For whoever needs them," meaning the records, meaning the truth, meaning the kept and careful fact of a thing. But also she understood now meaning her. Meaning, I am leaving you the tools. I am leaving you the practice. I am leaving you the proof that honest work outlasts the people who try to undo it. She had needed them. She had used them. And somewhere in the granite above Millhaven, the spring her father had documented in 1858 was still running quiet, constant, unremarkable from the outside, absolutely essential, from within the way the best things always are. The way she had always been, even when no one was looking. The way she still was now that everyone could see. Caleb came to her side with Ezra James still on his hip, and the important rock presented for her inspection, and she took it in her hand and turned it over and said, "That is a very good rock, with the specific gravity the situation demanded," and Ezra James looked satisfied in the way of someone whose findings have been validated by the right person. Caleb looked at her over the top of their son's head. She looked back. "Let's go home," she said. "Yeah," he said. And they did.